Death is an inevitable consequence of living, and someday we will all reach the end of the road, breathe our final breath, and find ourselves 6 feet under. There are many theories on what happens afterwards and where we end up, but one thing science can tell us for sure is what happens to our body. Does it just slowly decay away and become part of the earth, or do strange things continue to go on as if we were still alive? That's what we'll find out today, in this episode of the infographic show, Your Body After You Die. Most of us would rather not think about what happens to our body after we die. In the West, when someone dies, there is usually a traditional funeral so friends and family can say goodbye and get a sense of closure. A mortician will embalm the body as a way of slowing down the decomposition process so that family members can remember their loved one as they once were. For some, the end is less dignified. A murderer might leave his victim's body at the scene of a crime, or bury them in a shallow grave, or someone may die alone and isn't found for days or weeks. When this happens, and the body is discovered later, the decomposition process has already started making the mortician's job much harder. So what actually happens to our body when we die? Actually, the moment of death is not as instant as we may think. Even if you stop breathing and your heart ceases to beat, it is now understood that the brain goes on living for some time after. A 2017 study by the US National Library of Medicine National Institutes of Health, who measured brain activity after death, observed electroencephalographic recordings up to 5 minutes after the body was declared dead. In the hospital setting, doctors define death under a number of circumstances. These include no pulse, which indicates the heart has stopped beating, stopping breathing, the absence of reflexes, and pupils not reacting in response to a bright light. Just like you see in a TV crime show, when a detective walks up and shines a torch in the eyes of a dead person, just like you see in a TV crime show, when a detective walks up and shines a torch in the eyes of a dead person to be sure they're gone. The definition of brain death includes the neurologic criteria of unresponsiveness, an absence of brainstem reflexes, and an inability to breathe without a ventilator. So when the lights are finally out and you are actually gone, what happens to the body? Let's first look at from death to 12 hours after death. Hour 1. At the moment of death, all of the muscles in the body relax. This state is called primary flaccidity. The mouth often falls open, the eyelids relax, the pupils dilate, and the body is flexible. If an individual averages 80 beats per minute, that's 4,800 beats an hour, 115,200 beats per day, and more than 42 million per year, which calculates to roughly 3 billion if you live to age 72. Within minutes of the heart stopping, the blood stops flowing, and a process called pallor mortis causes skin color to lighten as blood drains from the smaller veins under the skin surface. The body begins to cool from its normal temperature of 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, and it continues to drop 2 degrees Celsius in the first hour, 1 degree after each hour thereafter. As the muscles relax, urine and feces are also released from the body. Hours 2 to 6. With no blood circulation, gravity begins to pull it to the areas of the body closest to the ground, a process known as livor mortis. After roughly 3 hours, chemical changes start to take place within the body cells, and all of the muscles begin to stiffen. This process is known as rigor mortis, and the first muscles to enter this state are the eyelids, jaw, and the neck. Rigor mortis continues to spread through the whole face, down through the chest, the arms, and eventually the fingers and toes. In the old days, people would place coins on the eyelids. This tradition might also have originated from the desire to keep the eyes shut, since rigor mortis affects the eyes soonest. However, there are other spiritually motivated theories, including one in Greek mythology, where a god of the underworld was responsible for carrying the souls of the deceased over the river that separated life and death, so a coin was placed on the eyes in order to pay him for transportation. Hours 7 to 12. Though rigor mortis will continue for up to 12 hours, from 7 hours onwards, the limbs of the corpse will be difficult to move. The knees and elbows will be slightly flexed, and fingers or toes may appear unusually crooked. How extreme these factors are will depend on the age, physical condition, and gender of the person, as well as the air temperature and other external factors. Hour 12. After reaching maximum rigor mortis, the body begins to soften again as the process of rigor mortis wears off in the reverse order in which it occurred, so from the fingers and toes to the arms and legs, and then up through the chest and to the neck and face. This is due to more chemical changes within the cells and internal tissue. This process occurs gradually and will continue over a period of 1 to 3 days, again influenced by external conditions such as temperature. After about 48 hours, all the muscles will again relax, reaching a state known as secondary flaccidity. That's the first 12 hours, but what if a body is left to decompose naturally for the next few days, weeks, or even months? Whilst doing our research, we came across a company, Aftermath Services, who can be called upon to clean up a dead body at a crime scene. Let's see what these corpse cleaning experts have to say. After a few days, leaked enzymes begin producing many gases, which cause the body to expand, sometimes as large as twice the usual size. If the corpse is out in the open, insects will start to investigate, including flies that lay eggs, later to become maggots that eat the flesh. And microorganisms and bacteria also produce extremely unpleasant odors called putrefaction. Next, all the soft parts of the body, including organs, muscles, and skin, become liquefied, and when all of the soft tissue has decomposed, bone, hair, cartilage, and other hard areas of decay remain. All that will be left at the end is the skeleton, which will usually take 8 to 12 years to decompose, depending on the loss of organic and inorganic components. The body decay timeline goes like this. 24 to 72 hours after death, the internal organs decompose. 3 to 5 days after death, the body starts to bloat and blood-containing foam leaks from the mouth and nose. 8 to 10 days after death, the body turns from green to red as the blood decomposes and the organs in the abdomen accumulate gas. Several weeks after death, nails and teeth fall out. 1 month after death, the body starts to liquefy. So your body may be around for a long time after death, even as long as 12 years for a brittle skeleton. But in some situations, these rules don't apply and the body can last a lot longer. This was the case in Wilmslow, Cheshire, northwest England, when on August 1st, 1984, when the preserved body of the so-called Lindo man was dug out of a peat bog by commercial peat cutters. Peat is a type of soil that contains acids with pH levels similar to vinegar, which can conserve the human body in the same way fruit is preserved in a pickling jar. It is thought that the Lindo man met his death in the Lindo Moss sometime between 2 BC and 119 AD in either the Iron Age or Romano-British period. So he may have lived around the time of Jesus. His body has been so well preserved for 2,000 years that we know he was a healthy male who died in his mid-20s, was around 5 feet 7 inches tall, and weighed 140 pounds. Some people do not want to think about the changes in the body after death, whereas others wish to know all of the gruesome details. Everyone is different, and it is a very personal decision.
The doctors won't say it, but you can tell from their eyes. Your time is running out. As you lie in the hospital bed, the minutes slipping away, your mind is racing. Ready or not, you're about to go on the biggest mystery that humanity has never been able to solve, into the unknown of death. Time seems to slow down in your last moments as you become more aware of every sensation. You can feel your breath starting to slow down, and you wonder if you'll know when you're dying or if you'll just slip away quietly. Will it be painful? Will you discover what lies beyond this mortal coil? Or will it just be like going to sleep? While your body is dying, what's your brain doing? What happens to the brain while the body is breathing its last? The human brain, 3.3 pounds of tissue, a mix of gray matter and white matter that serves as the control center for the entire body, composed of countless nerve cells and divided into 4 lobes, the frontal, temporal, parietal, and occipital lobes. It handles the senses and all mental functions. It leads to the brainstem, which controls the basic functions of the organs like the circulatory and respiratory systems, the spinal cord, which controls motor function, and the millions of nerves that control every little function in the body. The brain is like the general commander in an army of countless soldiers in your body, so it's not a surprise that you can't survive without it in working order. What happens to the brain at the moment of death? That depends on how you're dying. The first situation is when the brain kills the body. This is when the brain sustains a massive injury that makes it impossible for it to sustain the body. This happens when the brain is pierced by a bullet, hit by a large blunt object like a falling rock, or is badly concussed in a car accident or a sports game. It can also happen non-violently when a blood vessel bursts in the brain, causing a stroke or a brain aneurysm that floods the brain, drowning the vital nerves that keep things running. In a case like this, the brain shuts down quickly, often before the body realizes what happens. There's no time to process what's happening at the moment of death because the brain is the first to go, and the body soon follows. Sometimes the lower brain functions of the brainstem are preserved, and this is called brain death. The body is technically alive, but there's no consciousness left, and the person is usually taken off life support shortly. But what happens when the body is the first to go? The brain needs the body to be functioning so it can get the life-sustaining oxygen it needs to keep running. If the brain can't breathe and the circulatory system can't get blood to the brain will start starving and eventually die. This is common when other parts of the body are injured, such as a wound to a critical organ. It can also be caused by a heart attack, an illness like cancer, or old age as the body's organs start to slow down and wear out. There are more chances for medical intervention to save a life in this case, but there's only so much doctors can do and eventually time will run out. This is when the brain shuts down slowly and the people experience the sensation of dying while fully conscious. But how will we know what people experience? No one's been there and back. Or have they? Many people have claimed to have near-death experiences when they came close to death but were pulled back. This is common when someone has a traumatic and sudden physical ailment that brings them to the point of death and always involves the body but not the brain. Survivors of heart attacks, severe allergic reactions, surgical complications, or car accidents often recall making contact with something they believe is the afterlife. Doctors say this is the result of the lack of oxygen to the brain, causing hypoxia and hallucinations that feel especially intense given the trauma of the experience. But what do they see? And is it proof that death is not the end of the road? Most of the people who report this phenomenon are deeply religious and are intensely convinced that they made contact with heaven or somewhere else. When 3-year-old Colton Burpo underwent emergency surgery for a burst appendix, he nearly died on the operating table and came back with incredible stories of what heaven was like, including details of a long-dead relative he couldn't have known. He and his father wrote a book, Heaven is for Real, about his experience, but many critics say there are holes in the story and Colton was never clinically dead during the surgery. Another boy with a similar story, Alex Malarkey, later revised his own claims as a teenager. Paralyzed in a terrible car crash as a child, he woke up from a coma and claimed he had been carried by an angel during his near-death experience. But in 2015, he claimed that he had made the whole incident up and had never even read the Bible at the time of his injury. But what about those who saw the other place? When Matthew Botsford walked out of a restaurant and into the middle of a gun battle in 1992, he was struck by a bullet and wound up in a coma. He claimed to wind up in a place of total blackness and horror until he was lifted out of there by a figure he believed was God and returned to his body. He woke up after 27 days and recovered over a 2-year period, and he and his wife wrote a book about his close encounter with hell. But doctors are even more skeptical about his story because of the added factor of his brain injury. The brain is a complex organ, and a bullet inside it during a near-death experience could easily conjure up some horrifying visuals for the victim. The survivors of near-death experiences have their beliefs about what happens at the point of death. But what do scientists say? Ever since the technology was available, scientists have been studying the moment of death for clues to what happens to people. While no one knows exactly what the dying is experiencing and whether it points to something bigger, they have observed some amazing patterns in brain activity. Using EEG or electroencephalogram technology to track the activity in the brain, they've discovered that brain activity actually flares at the moment of death. When researchers tested the brain activity of rats that were euthanized, they discovered that the animal's consciousness was even more alert and intense than the normal waking state. Within 30 seconds of an induced cardiac arrest, the brain goes into overdrive. It implies something shocking. The brain doesn't die when the body does. How long can the brain survive after the body stops functioning? Most scientists believe it was only seconds, but doctors at a Canadian intensive care unit discovered something disturbing while working with terminally ill patients in 2018. After life support was turned off for 4 patients and they were declared dead, one of the patients' EEG continued to show brain activity for up to 10 minutes. There was no pulse and the pupils didn't retract when tested with light, but the patient's brain activity resembled the same frequency as deep sleep. Does the body simply put the brain to sleep and let it expire quietly during a non-traumatic death? Or is the dying person experiencing something more intense? One theory about the brain at the moment of death is called the dark wave. First observed in 1940 in experiments on rabbits, it indicated that when the brain is injured, it starts to spread brain death out from the injured spot. Brain functions go down one by one, drowning the brain in a deep wave of depressions as brain activity slowly decreases. This would mean the final moments of the brain function are likely confusing, disorienting, and marked by an increased loss of awareness. This is most common with death caused by brain injury, but what happens when the brain is expiring due to the loss of body function? Another theory proposes a much more optimistic view of our last moments. Many people have observed that those dying, even those in palliative care as they expire from terrible illness, have a peaceful or even euphoric expression on their face in their last hours. A study of rats at the moment of death indicated that the levels of serotonin in the blood tripled in their last minutes. Serotonin is a chemical believed to contribute to feelings of happiness and is matched by the powerful endorphins which have the same effect. If one of the body's last functions as it shuts down is to release these chemicals, it's likely that they take away the pain and the fear of death and allow the person to pass peacefully, enjoying a natural high that takes the edge off those last moments. But what's going through the mind in those last moments? Are people too far gone, or do they still know what's going on around them? The question of awareness around or even after the moment of clinical death has been puzzling scientists for many years, and new studies indicate that a person's consciousness can persist even after the bodily functions stop. A study of cardiac arrest survivors indicates that they correctly remember things that were said around them after their heart stopped. Those who were clinically dead may even remember having their deaths announced by medics and may be fully aware as their body functions fail them. These people were only dead for a short period and were revived through life-saving medicine, but it's likely that those who didn't get revived from their heart attack have the same experience in their last moments. The brain is a complex and durable organ, and it may have the ability to outlive the body briefly. What does this tell us about the moment of death? And is it possible to use this to learn more about what lies beyond? People have long been fascinated with the idea of conquering death or getting answers about it, and many stories have been written about people exploring the great beyond or returning from it. A horror movie, Flatliners, depicted a group of students who performed an experiment to stop their body functions and then resurrect themselves under a controlled environment. They came back wrong and developed strange new powers that led to carnage because it was a horror movie. But that hasn't stopped scientists from trying to figure out what people who have near-death experiences and came back from being clinically dead experienced. To get closer to the truth, we've got to look at the person who had the longest journey. Velma Thomas was 59 when she was taken to a West Virginia hospital for signs of a heart attack. She went downhill quickly and was pronounced brain dead when it was determined that she had no brain activity. Doctors tried to save her life by inducing hypothermia to lower her body temperature, but it was for naught, and her family was left to make funeral plans. But Thomas was an organ donor, and she was kept on life support for more than half a day until it was time to harvest the organs for transplant. That delay saved her life. It was 17 hours later, and the signs of death were setting in. Her son observed her skin hardening and her hands and toes starting to curl. But shortly after the family made the decision to take Velma off life support and no heartbeat was detected, something amazing happened. She started moving, and at first people thought it was just reflexes, but then she coughed and moved her eyes. And by the time her son returned to the hospital, his mother was already asking for him. She went on to make a full recovery and appeared on TV talk shows. But as for what she remembered about her time under, the answer seems to be nothing. And if she does, she's keeping it close to her chest. The evidence is that the brain is highly active at the moment of death, especially as someone dies from reasons other than brain injury. Those who have recovered from near-death experiences often have amazing stories, but those could easily be the result of hallucinations caused by unusual brain activity or oxygen deprivation. It seems to find out the truth of what happens to the brain at the moment of death, there's only one way to find out, but those who know aren't telling tales.
What happens when you finally kick the bucket, so to speak? Despite our mostly science-grounded views on death these days, it seems many of us believe in life after it. In 2014, UK citizens were polled by The Telegraph, and just under 60% of respondents said they believe some part of us lives on. In the US, still a very Christian nation, Pew Research in 2015 asked people what happened after you die. The survey found that 72% of Americans believed you go to heaven, which was described as a place where people who have led good lives are eternally rewarded. 54% of US adults replied that they believed in hell, which was described as a place where people who have led bad lives and die without being sorry are eternally punished. With that in mind, welcome to this episode of the Infographic Show, What Happens When You Die. Don't forget to subscribe and click the bell button so that you can be part of our notification squad. It seems a lot of people do believe that after death we might be ensconced in some cloud-strewn paradise, or conversely, if we haven't adhered to the ethics prescribed to us by our chosen religion or denomination of that religion, we might be faced with eternal hellfire and the prospect of groveling to a bearded red man who hardly ever puts down his pitchfork. But let's start with some empirical realism and what actually happens to the body when we die. Physicians know you're dead because the heart stops beating and there is no longer any electrical activity in your brain. Brain death equals dead, although machines can keep you going a little bit longer. You can also have what's called a cardiac death, which means the heart stops beating and blood no longer flows through your body. The strange, even wonderful thing is, people that have suffered cardiac death but have been brought back to life have said they were aware of what was going on around them. Others have talked about walking towards a light in such a near-death experience. You can be brought back from what we call clinical death, but you only have a grace period of about 4 to 6 minutes. But let's say you get to the light and pass through. This is what we call biological death. Game over, the final whistle, dead as a dodo. This is where it gets kind of undignified, but what do you care, you're dead. Once you're definitely no longer with us, your muscles relax, and this means your sphincter will too, meaning that triple whopper and large fries you had for lunch will spill out of you. The gas you have in you may also leak out and cause a stink. The same goes for the pee you've got in your bladder, so dying, not surprisingly, is a bit of a messy affair. And men, you might even ejaculate. As for women, you may give birth after you have died if you were pregnant, which is something called coffin birth. It doesn't happen often though. Instead of pushing, it's the gases in the abdomen that squeeze the newborn into the world. As the body gets rid of what is trapped inside, noises may be emitted from your mouth as air escapes. Nurses and people working close to dead bodies have regularly reported hearing very alive-sounding moans and groans coming from dead bodies. You may twitch, but this doesn't mean there is life in you, these are just muscle contractions. You could also soon get an erection if you died lying on your stomach and the blood flowed down there. All your blood will pool to a certain area of your body. This is called livor mortis, and it's the reason parts of you will have that dark purple color you have seen on TV. These are the lovely things that can happen quite shortly after you go. With no blood flowing through your body, it will begin to cool down, known as algor mortis, or simply death chill. It will keep cooling until it is the same temperature as your surroundings. You will become stiff within about 2 to 6 hours, and this we call rigor mortis. This is because calcium is getting into your muscle cells. Cells break down without blood flow, and this leads to bacteria growth, and that's why you start to decompose. You may look like your hair or your nails have grown, but that isn't the case. What is happening is that your skin is receding, giving the impression of growth. The skin will loosen too, and blisters will appear on the body. The next stage is putrefaction, when bacteria and microorganisms start feasting on you. You'll soon start to stink as bad as anything you could have imagined while you were alive. One person described the smell as rotten eggs, feces, and a used toilet left out for a month times 1,000. It is unholy. Soon everything that is soft becomes liquefied, with things like bones, cartilage, and hair remaining strong. You're already well on your way to decomposing by the time you are being put in the ground, but if embalmed and buried, decomposition could be a slow process. Left above ground, you'll be a liquefied mess within about a month, feasted on by insects, maggots, plants, and animals. Underground, some experts say it might take 8 to 12 years before you are reduced to nothing but a skeleton. After around 50 years, even your bones will become part of the earth. We should add the rate of decomposition depends on all manner of factors, too many to list here, but we think you get the picture. While some people report that their near-death experience was a scene to behold, that's not always the case. One person writing on Reddit said his experience was as follows. It was just black emptiness, no thoughts, no consciousness, nothing. Is there really something else? Irish empiricist philosopher George Berkeley was so hell-bent on knowing what happens after death, or those moments during clinical death, that he actually hanged himself to the point of death with a friend nearby ready to cut him down before he died. He believed there was something between heaven and earth, perhaps what philosophers have called the ether. The story has become lore in philosophical circles, but it's thought all Berkeley really discovered was that hanging hurts your neck. French philosopher René Descartes believed the soul was separate from the body, as many religions will tell you, and perhaps when we die, something lingers on. Friedrich Nietzsche talked about the concept of eternal recurrence, or eternal return, meaning all existence or energy in the universe has forever and will forever keep repeating itself ad infinitum. You live the same life again and again forever. Now, doesn't that make you want to live well? Here we can make similarities to the Buddhist belief of the Wheel of Samsara, wherein all souls or lives will begin a cycle again after death, except not the same exact life. Something we call reincarnation, which some people say is connected to what we sometimes call déjà vu. Buddhists believe we can end this vicious cycle if we can become truly enlightened, therefore achieving nirvana. Or do we make our way to heaven after our bodies stop working, tipping our cap to St. Peter at the pearly gates, hoping he won't deny us entrance for stealing that candy bar when we went on a school trip to Niagara Falls? Will we be taken into paradise, a place replete with excellent foods and gorgeous maidens that make your dead knees go weak? Or will we simply seed the earth, our souls nothing more than a worldly fancy that took our minds off our cosmic insignificance and the feeling of futility that we sometimes experience here on terra firma? Are you ready for Black Friday? This year will be on Friday, November 24th, a date which will no doubt see a certain kind of modern-day madness hit the streets. It starts the Christmas shopping season, and between Black Friday and the holidays, around 30% of all retail items for the year will be purchased. In 2016, an astounding 154 million Americans bought stuff online and in stores, spending $3.3 billion in total on Black Friday alone, according to Adobe. Over 3 days, shoppers spent as much as $7.23 billion, with retailers such as Amazon and Walmart rubbing their already smooth as silk hands. The average shopper didn't hold back, spending $289.19 according to the National Retail Federation. On the downside, 3 people died and a handful of others were seriously injured. On that note, welcome to this episode of the Infographic Show. How likely are you to die during a Black Friday sale? Don't forget to subscribe and click the bell button so that you can be part of our notification squad. First of all, why is it called Black Friday and not White or perhaps Pink Friday? There are a lot of theories out there, but according to those mythbusters at Snopes, it doesn't have anything to do with race. Rather, says Snopes, it originated around 1951 when the negative color of black was used to refer to millions of workers that called in sick after Thanksgiving. The term was later used in relation to the chaos of people shopping on that one day, given that they'd taken a day off. The day was a traffic nightmare and a pain for the police. Hence, the cops were largely responsible for calling that particular day black. In recent years, deaths and injuries and fights over such things as Lego pirate ships and cheap Hello Kitty socks have added to the black epithet. Nonetheless, the shopping frenzy has really only been utter chaos for more than a decade or so, and traditionally more of a US thing than a global thing. That has changed though, and Black Friday is spreading around the world. In 2016 in Leeds, UK, a serious Black Friday injury occurred when an off-duty policeman was stabbed in the neck for getting in the way of a shopper who thought he might take his goods without paying. Absolute madness, said one bystander, saying that the store had just opened its doors. Other countries besides the US and the UK are now celebrating Black Friday. These include Australia, Canada, China, Mexico, New Zealand, Japan, Romania, Norway, the Netherlands, Ukraine, Russia, India, Pakistan, South Africa, and more. In 2016, a riot broke out in the latter country over toilet paper that was going for cheap. The biggest shoppers, in the US anyway, are millennials aged 25 to 34, who account for 56% of all sales from physical stores in 2016. This group also accounts for 62% of online sales. That also means 8 out of 10 millennials went shopping that Black Friday. A frenzy for the most millennial consumer perhaps, but for retailers, it's their bread and butter with a cherry on top. Walmart said in 2016 that Black Friday and Thanksgiving had been bumper days, with Thanksgiving being the online shopping day. On Black Friday itself, Walmart said that the biggest sellers were game consoles, TVs, toys, drones, and believe it or not, pajamas. Other companies that do very well out of surging crowds are Target, Macy's, JCPenney, Kohl's, Foot Locker, Best Buy, American Eagle, and Urban Outfitters. According to Adobe, some of the biggest sellers throughout all stores included PlayStation 4, Microsoft Xbox One, Apple iPad, Samsung 4K TV, and Lego creator sets. According to research, one of the biggest things that drives sales nowadays is shopping via smartphones, with Target stating 60% of its online sales coming through a mobile device. Walmart said 70% of its Black Friday sales were made via mobile. Overall, from total sales for Black Friday 2016, 55% came from mobile, which was 45% via smartphone and 10% via tablet. While everyone seems to agree that foot traffic is falling, there are still millions of shoppers that prefer the old school shopping approach at brick and mortar stores. You may, however, get caught up in a melee, or worse. From the 3 deaths that occurred in the USA in 2016, one was a shooting in a Walmart parking lot in San Antonio, another was a shooting in a Walmart parking lot in Reno, and another was a shooting in a New Jersey mall. The victim's brother was shot too, but he survived. Maybe guns are still a big seller on Black Friday. 2015 and 2014 were thankfully good years with no Black Friday shopping deaths happening around the world, although injuries did occur. What's the worst of Black Friday events? According to Ranker, it was the 2008 Walmart stampede in which 2,000 ravenous consumers burst through the doors and trampled on top of each other. It was a scene befitting the social commentary zombie apocalypse movie, and one which must have seen filmmaker George Andrew Romero muttering to himself, "Told you so." People were beaten and even the cops got pushed aside, all for a cheap game console. One unfortunate worker was trampled to death and 4 more were seriously injured, including a pregnant woman. 2008 was a bad year for celebrating consumerism the only way we know how on Black Friday. In another case, 2 men went shopping for toys and both of them didn't get out of Toys R Us alive. It started with their partners getting into a fistfight in the aisles and ended with both men pulling out guns and killing each other in the store. What about your safety? Well, given that just a handful of deaths have occurred over the last decade linked to Black Friday shopping, we can say that you're pretty safe. The US murder rate did go up 8.6% in 2016, following a 10.8% increase in 2015, according to the FBI. But this was mostly due to spikes in gang-related murders in places such as Baltimore, Chicago, St. Louis, Washington, D.C., and Milwaukee. If we delve into the issue of mass shootings, well, Black Friday would seem like a day when that could happen given the crowds that amass in small areas waiting for stores to open. If you are part of the mob of shoppers, well, you know the risks, which could just be getting an accidental elbow in your face. If it makes you feel any better, the National Safety Council said that almost 40,000 Americans died in traffic accidents in 2016, and another 4.6 million people were injured, so driving to the store is statistically a lot more dangerous than shopping in it. If at all possible, don't take your gun with you this Black Friday. In the spirit of Kantian philosophy and his categorical imperative, if everyone abides by the no gun rule, no one will get shot.
We've talked about what happens when you die, an episode that was very popular. Now we tackle a similar question: what happens just before you die? This question comes to us from Jody. As you may already know, we love answering questions from you, our beloved viewers. So today, as per Jody's request, we dare to venture deep into the subject in our quest to find out if your life really does flash before your eyes in your final moment. To begin with, we'll start with what happens to you physically, depending on how you die. Let's first talk about drowning. This is a very uncomfortable death, characterized by an inability to breathe that leads to your demise underwater. What happens is that you struggle with your mouth below the surface, you panic and might begin to aspirate and inhale water. This leads you to having a laryngospasm, which happens when your vocal cords close and block airways in an attempt to protect your lungs. When this happens, you're unable to scream for help. Thus, drowning is mostly a silent death. When not enough oxygen reaches the body's tissues, you then go through something known as hypoxia. You become unconscious and your airway relaxes, which allows your lungs to fill up with water. Prolonged time without air can lead to cardiac arrest and brain damage before finally leading to death. This is not a good way to go, so it's highly recommended that you wear a life vest if you don't know how to swim. Either that or keep an inflatable pool toy under you. The unicorn floaty is all the rage right now. Get one with a cup holder while you're at it, so you can keep a martini on hand. Death by hypothermia, where the core body temperature drops to a dangerous level, causes you to shiver intensely. After extended exposure to freezing temperatures, your body functions start to slow down, including your respiration, heart, and metabolic rates. You then lose consciousness before you die. An example of this type of death would include what happened to Jack in the movie Titanic. Spoiler alert, we saw him turn into a human popsicle before he sunk dramatically into the dark depths of the Atlantic. Rose let go of him in the moment after saying she wouldn't. What's up with that? We feel that we need to add that Jack could have easily fit onto the door that was used as a raft. He just didn't try hard enough. At any rate, you definitely wouldn't want to perish in icy cold waters this way. It's not a fun way to go, especially if you hate the cold. On the opposite end of the spectrum, death by burning has to be a very horrifying way to meet your demise. Sometimes when people were burned at the stake back in the Dark Ages, they would die from carbon monoxide poisoning before the flames completely consumed them. This happens when you breathe in too much carbon. It's definitely not a pleasant way to go. In fact, it's excruciatingly painful. Yet carbon monoxide poisoning would have been considered a merciful death in comparison to feeling a fire melt away your flesh. The human body can burn for several hours, but if you're lucky, you're already dead by the time the dermis cracks. The dermis, in case you didn't know, is the thick layer of skin under the epidermis, which is the thin layer of outer skin. Sometimes burns can cause so much damage to your nerves that you're no longer able to detect pain. More than likely, however, you've already died before you can recognize that you don't feel pain anymore. The initial agony of being burned alive can also be so intense that some people may die of primary shock, when blood pressure drops so low that vital organs can no longer function. Suffocation from the fumes and heat stroke can also result in death before the actual flames do the job. With heat stroke, your brain and other vital organs swell, which can be fatal if left untreated. Now that we've covered some of the extreme, horrific, morbid aspects of physical causes of death and what happens to the body before dying, let's explore what might happen mentally before you die. We mean aside from the obvious panic you might experience if you're aware of what's happening to you. This is a big topic because there are a lot of strange and abnormal things people claim to have happened in the moments just before death. Neurologist Dr. Cameron Shaw believes he knows exactly what happens to us 30 seconds before we meet the Grim Reaper. He's dissected a woman's brain in order to find out what was going on immediately before she died. What he found was chilling. First, he says, we lose our sense of self. This reportedly is because the brain tends to die from the top down, and blood supply is gathered from underneath. Thus, the prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for cognition, planning, personality, decision-making, and moderating social behavior, loses blood first as the brain drains. This implies that our sense of self, sense of humor, and our ability to think ahead all dissipates within the first 10 to 20 seconds out of the 30-second countdown to death. Then Dr. Shaw explains, as the wave of blood starts starved brain cells spread out, our memories and language centers short out, and we're left with just a core. By this point, you have no awareness of what's happening. Not to be overly grim, but you basically shut down, go blank, fall into the dark pit of nothingness, whatever you prefer to call it. Dr. Shaw says that you do see a white light at the end of a tunnel before you die, but not necessarily because you're drifting into heaven. We hate to break it to you, but Dr. Shaw says this happens when the sudden loss of blood supply to the brain causes tunnel vision. The first thing that's noticed is a feeling of being faint, as well as the narrowing of your vision, which is followed by an ominous or peaceful darkness depending on how you perceive it. But it all has to do with the loss of blood to your head. Dr. Shaw also explains the concept of the out-of-body experience, which many people have claimed to have been through during life-threatening near-death experiences. This is said to happen when people perceive themselves to be floating through the air like a spirit, ghost, or apparition. They see objects in another room or the tops of people's heads from an aerial view. Dr. Shaw that this is just a trick of the mind and that it's not real. He claims that the out-of-body experience is little more than a myth. He says, quote, "The brain can create a visual world around you that resembles something close to reality that isn't reality because you're actually blind." What we think he means by this is that you're blind to your surroundings while in this state of mind because you're basically unconscious. Some people who have experienced the out-of-body sensation, however, will continue to assert that this was very real to them. Many will jump to its defense. Now, what about the question regarding whether your life flashes before your eyes? You may be interested to know that yes, indeed it does, but not in the way you think. What we mean to say is that you won't visualize yourself as a baby and watch yourself grow up. It doesn't happen chronologically like in the movies. You'll simply witness key memories randomly based on importance and which events sparked the greatest emotion for you. In the final moments, you'll think about the most notable or prominent moments of your life. The most memorable aspects of your existence pop into your thoughts: your first kiss, graduation, holidays with your family, the day you got married to your spouse, the day your first child was born, and more. Some people who have experienced this near-death occurrence say that many memories were packed into a short period of time. Some have even gone so far as to say that it felt like centuries had passed while they were witnessing the memories of their lives play out before them like a movie across a screen. One person claimed being able to actually feel what friends and family members felt through each memory. The same person was quoted in an article in The Sun saying, "I was allowed to see part of them and feel for myself what they felt." In essence, empathy for others was said to be directly experienced during this ordeal. Perhaps this was to teach a life lesson about consideration for others. Philosophically, we can only speculate. Now, Dr. Cameron Shaw is not the first or last professional to study what happens before you die. And if you watched our video called "Did Scientists Really Find a Way to Bring the Dead Back to Life?", then you may have learned that a study on pig brains revealed that the organ can continue to function cellularly after pronounced clinically dead. This means that it's theoretically possible to be partially dead or partially alive. Creepy. In all likelihood, however, you're not conscious enough to realize that you are somewhat dead. For those who have ever been around someone with a terminal illness in their final moments of life, often it's said that a loss of consciousness is the first physical change to occur. Still, even while unconscious, the person might still be able to hear or feel you. After consciousness goes, there may be changes to the skin, where it becomes slightly blue in color. Breathing may become loud as mucus builds up in the throat. As the end draws nearer, shallow breathing may stop and start again between breaths. This is known as Cheyne-Stokes breathing. It can last for a short or long time before finally stopping entirely. During the bodily transition to death, it's likely that you're not distressed or in pain because you're not aware that you're dying. For this reason, many believe that the changeover is relatively peaceful because, as the common saying goes, ignorance is bliss. Some people choose when and where to die and are able to hang on a little longer until a loved one arrives at their bedside. Others may not be so lucky and may be unable to control when they go. Many people often feel guilty for not being there at the precise moment when their loved one passed. They might feel like they let the person down by missing the crucial moment. It might be of comfort to know that the person was probably not aware of your absence when they passed. Still, if friends or family members are distressed by the passing of their loved one, they're usually referred to consult with a bereavement counselor who's trained in helping people who are undergoing these exact situations. Counselors can be very helpful and beneficial with assisting people through the difficult grieving process. Receiving bereavement support is important, and we'd strongly recommend doing so if you've just lost someone close to you. On the Ides of March, or March 15th, a great Roman man called Julius Caesar was assassinated when he was stabbed an estimated 23 times. Many more influential people around the world would meet a similar fate in the years to come. Those who fell to the hand of an assassin or assassins include the great Mahatma Gandhi, John F. Kennedy, and the man suspected of killing him, Lee Harvey Oswald. Then you have the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, something blamed for kicking off World War I. President Abraham Lincoln took a bullet to the head, while Martin Luther King Jr. was also assassinated the American way, killed with a firearm. Today we're going to introduce you to someone you might not have heard about, but you should have. His story is fascinating and his death is intriguing. This man, known as Ramesses III, was the second pharaoh of the 20th dynasty in Egypt, and his reign lasted from 1186 to 1155 BC. That's a long time ago, but if you want to see what this guy vaguely looked like, you can, because you can search for images of his mummy online. And you know what people are saying about those remains these days? That it looks like old Ramesses had his throat slit. But let's rewind just a little bit. From what we know about the man, he was a good if not great leader. During his time as pharaoh, what's known as the New Kingdom or Egyptian Empire was coming to an end. As empires always tend to do, it was heading toward decline. After he was gone, the trouble really started. But while he was in charge, he was successful, having beat back Libyan armies twice and making short shrift of the Sea Peoples. These people didn't get into Egypt, but they would attack again. It's said in all, our hero today and his armies fought them off 3 times. As one historian points out, these fights were big deals. He writes, "It should be stressed that the invasions were not merely military operations, but involved the movements of large populations, by land and sea, seeking new lands to settle." Let's just say Ramesses, having won a trio of invasions, likely won over a lot of people. How do we even know what went down more than 3,000 years ago? We don't really. Not exactly. But historians rely on what the inscriptions say at Ramesses III's Medinet Habu mortuary temple. You can also hear this in something called the Harem Papyrus. As for those who reached my frontier, their seed is not. Their heart and their soul are finished forever and ever. As for those who came forward together on the seas, the full flame was in front of them at the Nile's mouths, while a stockade of lances surrounded them on the shore, prostrated them on the beach, slain and made into heaps from head to tail. Yeah, he messed them up. Okay, so he won battles. But when empires go into decline, it always starts with a lot of infighting, usually peppered with decadence and many bad decisions. We also have to take into account that some of the people he defeated were settled nearby, and this might have led to new states being formed that would lead to the empire's downfall. Egypt had been fighting on land and in the sea, and as you know, especially if you check out our cost of defense shows, constantly being a warlike nation or defending yourself means spending tons of cash. No empire in the past has ever survived overspending when fighting on too many fronts. This economic turmoil took its toll on the normal people, and they had to put up with the ancient form of austerity, which basically meant less grain. When the people suffer when it looks like there's no way out, usually a bunch of other powerful people get together and start machinating about how to get rid of the failing leader. This is where our conspiracy comes in. We're told that for a long time, no one really knew how exactly Ramesses had been assassinated. Papyrus court documents were found that indeed tell us that a coup had been planned. This is known as the Harem conspiracy because the key figures behind the murder were said to be one of Ramesses' second wives and her co-conspirators because she wanted to put her son, Pentawere, in charge. This is how the tale goes. It was just a normal night in Ramesses' harem, but little did he know that one of his many wives were planning to take him out, as well as his son Ramesses IV, and give power to her child. She had before this enlisted various officials who it said were in on the plan, doubtless worried by the state of the empire. She needed a lot of help though, and even got kitchen staff and other servants in on the action. It's said the most important ally in this assassination was a pantry chef called Pabekamen. You see, not just anyone could walk right into the harem. To get in, Pabekamen had to enlist a few helpers himself, and it was all looking rather like an ancient Egyptian version of Ocean's 11. But given the time, the conspirators also employed those who were able to use black magic to weaken both the pharaoh and the guards around him. It's said that while the actual assassination was in play, someone was casting spells and performing incantations. We cannot verify if this part of the killing process worked, but with modern science, we're sure skeptical. It seems the attack was successful, but there's always been a shade of mystery as to how he actually died. We'll get around to that, but we can say the assassination did work. We might also add that Ramesses IV was not felled, and this spelled trouble for the gang of murderous usurpers. In a document called the Judicial Papyrus of Turin, it's written that people were put on trial and names were revealed. It's also said a number of officials in on the plot had been blackmailed, but that didn't save all of them. That document reads that in all, 27 men and 6 women were convicted of high treason and another 5 of corruption. It also reads that most of them should be killed, with the document saying that the court was not killing them, but their actions had killed them. It's not known exactly how they were put to death, but we're told that a number of them took their own lives. 3 of them got off lightly too, and they were merely disfigured. Another got an ancient slap on the wrist. The son who would be king, Pentuer, may have killed himself. No one knows for sure, but some documents seem to infer that he was forced to take his own life. The empire was a mess. The pharaoh had been slaughtered. The other main players had either been killed or were perhaps worried about the state things were in. This was the beginning of the Great Descent that led toward the end of the empire. But how did Ramesses die? Did he actually have his throat slit? Live Science tells us that researchers had for a long time been mulling over the actual cause of death, with some people saying he was stabbed, slashed, and he died immediately, but other people saying he was hurt but lasted another 3 days. So scientists got a hold of the mummy, but this time they were armed with a computed tomography machine, and they performed what are known as CT scans. The large and deep cut wound in his neck must have been caused by a sharp knife or other blade, said the scientists. They added that it was quite the deep wound, and whoever got Ramesses' neck had severed his large blood vessels as well as his trachea and esophagus. Their conclusion was that there was no way in hell that the great pharaoh did much after this, as such a vicious cut would have killed him almost instantly. That also had another surprise. They found an amulet buried in his throat. This had been buried by bandages and no one had ever seen it before. Most probably, the ancient Egyptian embalmers tried to restore the wound during mummification by inserting the amulet and by covering the neck with a collar of thick linen layers, wrote the researchers. The amulet, no doubt, was to give him some good luck as he passed into the underworld. But they went even further and went to inspect a mummy they believed was Pentuer. This mummy was known as Unknown Man E. So did he really kill himself? They don't really know, but they did say genetic analysis made them feel pretty sure that they'd got their mummy. It was the son, and all they could say about his death is that his utterly horrific contorted expression likely means he died horribly. They said he might not have actually killed himself, stating he may have been poisoned or even buried alive. Pentuer didn't get an amulet either. He got a goat skin. In ancient Egypt, this was regarded as a really dirty, impure thing. So in modern times, it was like he got buried with a mangy old sock or a used toothbrush. They likely wanted him to suffer as much as possible during his eternal journey to the underworld. This all sounds a bit grim, but you just have to look at the photo of this mummy going through the CT scan machine. Talk about old world meets the modern world. It's thought that the great leader was around 62 years old when he died, which is quite the run for someone in those days. What's perhaps more amazing is Ramesses II, who reigned for 62 years, lived until the ripe old age of either 91 or 92. In space, no one can hear you scream. It's hard to think of a sci-fi movie where at least one person doesn't end up dying in space. You've probably seen bodies instantly freeze, have an alien erupt out of their chest, or even explode. However, this is not what actually happens to a body that's exposed to the vacuum of space. And none of these movies ever discuss what happens to your body after death. Let's use science to find out the truth about what actually happens to your body if you die in space. 18 people have died in space or preparing to go into space since Yuri Gagarin first left our planet's atmosphere on April 12, 1961. This is actually a relatively low number considering how hostile space is to the human body. But as we plan to venture beyond our own planet and explore the solar system, death in space is going to become more and more common. As of right now, NASA's official statement of what to do with a dead body if someone dies off-planet is lacking in specifics. In fact, they say NASA does not prepare contingency plans for all remote risks. Basically, they'll figure it out if it ever happens. That being said, astronauts do run scenarios where they need to quarantine a body from the rest of the crew during a spaceflight. Before we dive into what would happen to a dead body that was left to endlessly float through our outer space, let's clear up some misconceptions. Movies and television shows are made to entertain. This means the more dramatic, the better, especially when someone is exposed to the vacuum of space. So let's look at the actual science and see what would actually occur to someone's body in space. It is pretty common in sci-fi to see someone instantly freeze as soon as they're exposed to space. Would this really happen? The answer is no. When you think about it, space doesn't actually have a temperature. Temperature is caused by the amount of matter in an area and how quickly it's moving. The faster the atoms move, the more heat they give off, the higher the temperature is. If there is no matter, like in the vacuum of space, there can be no temperature. There are a lot of other things that can kill you, but you will not instantly turn into a popsicle. Your body is around 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit on average. When exposed to space, your body will still be 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. However, you will start to lose some of that heat eventually, but it's not instantaneous. The reason the loss of heat is relatively slow is because of the way heat is transferred. Normally, differences between two systems, such as your body and the air outside it, allow heat to flow from where it is warmer to where it is cooler. Since there's very little to no matter in outer space, this transfer of heat can't happen. Therefore, your body does not instantly lose all of its heat the moment your skin is exposed to space. However, heat can also be lost or gained through radiation, and since there is radiation coming from all the stars as well as from the creation of the universe during the Big Bang, the transfer of energy through radiation does occur. For example, if you are directly in the path of the sunlight, the radiation from the sun could actually make you slightly warmer for a short time. If you're in the shadow of a planet or other celestial object, your body will radiate heat away from you and into space. The transfer of heat through radiation is slow, and therefore, even if you're thrown into space without a spacesuit, your body will not instantly lose all of its heat. Other space deaths in cinema depict someone exploding from extreme changes of pressure. Again, this would not happen. There is definitely a change in pressure between the interior of a ship and space, but that change in pressure would not result in someone exploding. However, the lack of pressure would definitely have negative effects on the human body and would cause death after prolonged periods of time, but not death by explosion. Humans and all life on the planet evolved under Earth's atmospheric pressure. When there is no pressure pushing on your body, there are negative consequences. Without Earth's atmospheric pressure pushing against you, the air inside your lungs and in your veins expands. The expansion does not have enough force to cause your body to explode from the inside out, but it could rupture your lungs unless it is immediately exhaled. Oftentimes in movies, when the protagonist needs to venture through space without a protective suit, they're told to exhale. This is actually sound scientific advice to keep your lungs from rupturing due to the sudden change in pressure. A pressure change can also cause the water in your blood to convert from a liquid into a gas. This can cause bubbles in the blood and swelling of muscles and tissues, which can result in an embolism. An embolism is when bubbles in the bloodstream block the flow of blood to vital organs such as the brain. This can certainly lead to death, but cannot cause your body to explode. A final major concern about exposing your body to the vacuum of space is that there is no oxygen, which means death is inevitable if you do not have a spacesuit on that provides you with this vital gas. When in the vacuum of space, oxygen literally diffuses out of the bloodstream and is lost to the outside environment. This leads to hypoxia or oxygen deprivation. Within 15 seconds of deoxygenated blood reaching the brain, you can go unconscious. Your body could survive about a minute in an unconscious state from lack of oxygen, but soon after that, you're dead. This brings us to the main question. What happens to the body after someone dies in space? It is clear that the human body cannot last long before death occurs. But once you're dead, what happens to your remains? We know that your body would not instantly freeze, but after a while, when the heat is radiated from your remains, you would become a popsicle. In terms of preservation of a body, this is actually a good thing. On Earth, once a living thing dies, it immediately begins to be broken down by decomposers such as bacteria. However, in space, there is no oxygen or gases of any kind, and therefore, no decomposers can survive to break you down. If your body is not near a source of heat, such as a star, the body will freeze and stay that way for eternity, or until you crash into something and shatter into a million tiny pieces. On the other hand, if your dead, exposed body is close to a source of radiation, such as a star, your remains could be cooked. If it's an intense source of radiation, you would get a really nasty radiation burn. But then again, you'd already be dead, so it probably wouldn't bother you too much. If you died in a spacesuit, however, things would be very different. Say, for example, you were struck by a micrometeor. If you were able to patch a hole in the suit, but then died, decomposition would actually start to occur right then. Your exhaled air and any oxygen left in the suit would allow for decomposers to begin breaking you down. Also, since your body is contained within the spacesuit, it would take much longer for the heat to radiate from your body, which would also allow decomposers to do their work more efficiently. One main difference between decomposition in a spacesuit versus decomposition on Earth would be the source of the decomposers. On planet Earth, there are decomposers in the environment, like in the air, soil, water, etc. However, in space, the only decomposers are inside your body. The bacteria that make up your microbiome would literally decompose you from the inside out. To be fair, you aren't using your body anymore if you're dead, so why not let it serve as food for the microorganisms living inside of you? The bacteria inside you decompose your body after you die on Earth as well, but there are outside decomposers available on our planet that aren't in space. At some point, the bacteria would use up the remaining oxygen in the spacesuit, and then something really incredible happens. The bacteria move from aerobic respiration, using oxygen to generate energy for life processes, to using anaerobic respiration. Anaerobic respiration does not require any oxygen. One form of anaerobic respiration is fermentation, so the bacteria in your body would actually break down your nutrients and create alcohol as a byproduct. You wouldn't be alive to enjoy the alcohol, but it's still pretty cool. If there was a source of radiation from a star like the sun, it would break down your body pretty quickly if you were directly in its path. But there's also a small amount of radiation from the remnants of the Big Bang throughout the entire universe, but it's not very much. The background radiation would also break down the spacesuit eventually, although this could take thousands of years, and at that point any living thing such as bacteria would die with you in space. Hypothetically, if you were close enough to a source of radiation, and the spacesuit broke down while there were gases in it from the decomposition of your body, something really crazy would happen. The process of respiration and fermentation create gases such as carbon dioxide as a byproduct. This means the bacteria would be filling the spacesuit with gas and increasing the pressure within it while breaking down your body. If the spacesuit was suddenly compromised by a tear or radiation, the result could be a small explosion. The spacesuit would tear apart, releasing all the gases at once in a silent explosion, since sound waves can't be created in the vacuum of space. Something that has come up recently as NASA and other space agencies prepare to launch manned missions to Mars and beyond is what to do with the body of an astronaut who has died on a mission. There's no set plan yet, but it has been discussed because as humans venture further and further from their protective shield of Earth, accidents are bound to happen. People will die in space at some point. So what would the other astronauts do with the body itself? On a space station or ship, there is air for the crew to breathe. This means that there is oxygen, and therefore decomposition of a dead body will occur. The body needs to be sealed away somewhere quickly because it will begin to smell. There's also the problem of the body being a biohazard. A bunch of nasty pathogens can be passed on from one human to another while handling a dead body, and the longer the corpse is allowed to decompose, the worse things can get. There are a couple of contingency plans that have been thought up by space agencies if an astronaut dies in their spacesuit. It would make the most sense to keep them in the spacesuit and trap the gases of the dead body within. The suits themselves are self-contained, and nothing would be able to get in or, more importantly, out. Once the body is secured, it would then be moved to one of the colder parts of the spacecraft. This might be near one of the airlocks, but it should definitely be away from the rest of the crew. Other options of what to do with a dead body in space could be to send it back to Earth on a resupply ship, or jettison the body and let it burn up in the atmosphere of whatever the closest planet is. For example, both Mars and Venus have atmospheres that could be used as a means of cremating a body on re-entry if Earth is too far away. However, if the body needs to be preserved and returned to a planet so that it can be buried, there are ways to keep a body along for the ride without keeping it inside the spaceship. One method of dealing with a dead body during a long space mission is to mount it on the outside of the spacecraft. If kept on the side of the ship facing away from the sunlight, the dead body would eventually become freeze-dried. Then the crew could choose from a few different ways of disposing of it. Once the body is frozen, it could be released from the ship and sent on a trajectory to be incinerated by a nearby star, or the path chosen might allow the corpse to float endlessly through space. If the explorers don't want to litter space with human debris, they could wait until the body is completely frozen and then use a robotic arm to smash it into small crystallized pieces. This might seem gruesome, but it would cause the body to break up into minuscule fragments, which would eventually burn up in an atmosphere or be broken down by radiation. Humans are on the verge of venturing out of near-Earth orbit and heading to other planets and beyond. It's a fact of life that everyone dies, and as more and more people travel to space, this natural process will occur beyond our planet. You won't explode if exposed to the vacuum of space, but you will eventually freeze, leaving your body destined to float around the universe for eternity, or until you crash into something.
Despite being one of the most exciting and rich periods in history, the Middle Ages were a tough time to live in. Among other horrible things, that time period experienced a plague that wiped out 75 million folks across Europe, Africa, and the Middle East, high infant mortality, famine, and battles. Add to that a social infrastructure that was frankly shocking, and zero social welfare. But just how dangerous was it to live in the Middle Ages, and what would your chances be of actually surviving the period? That's what we'll find out today, in this episode of the Infographic Show, Most Common Ways People Died in the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages, or medieval period, lasted from the 5th to the 15th century. It began with the fall of the Roman Empire and led into the Renaissance and Age of Discovery. This period predates the discovery of penicillin and germ theory, meaning that death by disease was a common occurrence among medieval people. Poor health conditions and malnutrition added to the problem. Diseases and conditions common to the period were dysentery, gonorrhea, influenza, leprosy, malaria, measles, smallpox, typhoid, and puerperal fever. In the Prussian town of Elbing in August 1349, the Black Death was first recorded, and this terrible illness has long been associated with death in the Middle Ages. Studies have shown that people around this period had a life expectancy somewhere in the 30 to 40s. That piece of data is, according to some sources, misleading, as the life expectancy rate was dragged down significantly by the high infant mortality rate caused by death at childbirth and disease in infancy. Many people did in fact live to 60 or 70 years of age or older during the Middle Ages. Enrico Dandolo became the Doge of Venice at the age of 85 and died old and blind at 98 in the year 1205. However, death by childbirth was a serious problem as hygiene was yet to be fully understood. Both the rich and poor died in childbirth. Queens often died while giving birth to future princes and princesses, thus greatly affecting lines of inheritance and courses of history. Richer families could usually afford to hire a wet nurse if the mother died during childbirth, but peasant families were forced to be more inventive by soaking bread in milk for the infant to ingest, or even soaking a rag in milk and letting the child suckle from the rag. Death arrived to children in the shape of germs and viruses that people in the Middle Ages had no idea led to disease, having had no knowledge of germ theory. There were no antibiotics or vaccines to protect the most vulnerable members of society, the very old and the very young. The death rate for children was horrendously high, and to survive birth and infancy put one in good stead for the pursuant obstacles this tough period in history brought. Poor medical care, weak immune systems, infectious diseases, and hunger killed countless of people during the Middle Ages, but perhaps no event was as undeniably devastating as the Black Death. 1/3 of the population of Europe between 1347 and 1352 were wiped out by bubonic and pneumonic plagues that ravaged the region. This outbreak was probably the most deadly force, the most tragic pandemic event to have swept through a populated region, killing at least 75 million people throughout Europe, Northern Africa, and the Middle East. If we factor in that the population of Europe was thought to be around 70 million in 1350, then yes, the plague was responsible for a huge number of deaths. And if we were living at that time in Europe, many of us would have become part of the estimated 50% of Europe's population who fell victim to it. And then there were those who died on the battlefield. Hacked and cut with weapons, and with no means to properly clean infected wounds, soldiers often led short, brutal lives. However, casualties in medieval battles were often surprisingly light. Once one side had lost 5 to 10% of their number, noblemen and officers were often held to ransom. Many army casualties were slayed by disease, foodborne poisoning, and septicemia instead. Amputations were not to be taken lightly, and many died from contamination and dirty surgical instruments. Anesthetic was unheard of, and if drinking enough alcohol wouldn't stop the screams, you may have been knocked with a blow to the head instead. Those higher-ranking officers, who were able to access the cutting-edge medical science at the time, enjoyed leeches applied to wounds, or perhaps a course of bloodletting. Traveling was no picnic either. Finding a safe place to stop while traveling was troublesome, and folks often had to resort to sleeping out in the open, running a risk of freezing to death in the winter or being robbed or killed on the road. Food was also hard to come by on the road, and the traveler was often forced to forage, steal, or go without. Lack of foreign languages could be problematic, and travelers may find themselves caught up in local disputes or battles, and things weren't much better at sea. While it was faster to travel by sea, boarding a vessel put the traveler at risk of sudden storms or shoddy navigation. The ships themselves weren't particularly safe until later in the Middle Ages. Too much of a good thing can be bad for us. Water, which we need to consume on a regular basis if we want to survive, could be our downfall if we imbibe too much of the stuff. Yes, you can literally drink yourself to death. This is known as water intoxication, and it happens more often than you might think. Plenty of natural foods can pose a danger if we consume too much of them, and especially if we haven't cooked them. While there are lots of poisonous mushrooms out there, famed mycologist Paul Stamets warns us about eating too many mushrooms that haven't been cooked well. We know that some fruit pits can be bad, or that too many potatoes of a certain kind can cause havoc, but today we'll concentrate on our little yellow friend. In this episode of the Infographic Show, how many bananas would you have to eat in order to die from radiation? Don't forget to subscribe and click the bell button so that you can be part of our notification squad. World Atlas tells us that the most popular fruit in the world is the tomato. Yes, we know most people regard this red beauty, pronounced tomato in the UK, as a vegetable, but technically it's a fruit. The Oxford English Dictionary tells us we get it mixed up because it's generally used for cooking in savory dishes. Anyway, World Atlas explains that the second most eaten fruit across the world is the banana. There is hardly a place where it isn't enjoyed, with the annual consumption being about 114 million metric tons. The United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization also tells us bananas are the most widely consumed fruit, with exports in 2014 amounting to almost $11 billion. In third place was watermelon and then apples. According to the Packer 2017 Fresh Trends report, bananas were the most eaten fruit in the USA, but then it had tomatoes as the most consumed vegetable, not fruit. Right, so we know most people are fond of eating bananas. Now to the point, how bad can they be for you? Well, you might already know that eating too many of them can give you a stomachache. Generally, they shouldn't, but if you are eating bananas that are not very ripe, the amount of starch in the banana can cause gas, just like any other starchy food. Health websites also say some people are simply banana intolerant, and that is why certain people feel abdominal pain when they eat them. You can handle the stomach pain, but can too many bananas kill you? The BBC, usually regarded as a quality source of news, asked a seemingly ridiculous question in 2015. That was, can eating more than 6 bananas at once kill you? The BBC points out that this question became popularized after it was brought up by UK television celebrity Carl Pilkington when talking with Ricky Gervais and Stephen Merchant. While the latter two write and perform comedy, the former is better known for his absurd and sometimes short-sighted worldview. Nonetheless, Pilkington was actually onto something. While the body needs potassium, too much potassium can be bad for us. Pilkington believed that potassium was the problem, but a scientist in the BBC report stated that you'd have to eat about 400 bananas a day for anything slightly bad to happen, and that 6 a day is actually good for you. Snopes also picked up on this and asked the scientist if there is an unhealthy number of bananas one could eat in one sitting that might cause banana overdose. They said that indeed 18 grams of potassium ingested quickly could be dangerous for the kidneys, but that would mean someone gouging on around 42 bananas in one sitting. Nobody would do that, and we suggest you don't try. But bananas pose another danger in a way. They are radioactive. There are naturally occurring radioactive isotopes in the fruit, and that's why we have something called the banana equivalent dose. This has been used to measure radiation in the body. Bananas do contain radioactive isotopes, so much so that they have been known to set off radiation sensors used at US ports where smuggling of nuclear materials could occur. According to another BBC report on the radiation banana issue, the standard measure of the biological effect of radiation is the skeivert. But that's a massive dose, and a banana only contains about 1/10 of a millionth of that. But you can still measure radiation doses in bananas. Sounds crazy, and why would anyone do that? Well, mostly because it's a nice way of checking how much radiation one is exposed to. You could use a banana to check radiation levels in the body compared to other food sources close to a site where it's thought foods may have been contaminated with radiation, such as milk. Still, critics of the measurement have said this doesn't take into account how much of the banana radiation is absorbed by the body after it's eaten. In fact, experts say your body will just get rid of the excess radioactive isotope, potassium-40. But could you still die from radiation poisoning if you ate an incredibly large number of bananas? Ramzi Amri, a postdoctoral fellow at Harvard Medical Mass General Surgical Oncology, tried to answer that question. His answer? Yes, you will certainly die from radiation poisoning if you are able to eat 10 million bananas at once. He also said that if you ate 274 bananas a day for 7 years, you'd have chronic symptoms. This would naturally be impossible, and if you tried it, it is likely that your stomach would rupture well before radiation was any kind of threat. There have never been any cases of radiation poisoning from eating too many bananas. On the other hand, we suggest you don't eat a mountain of apple seeds lest you become the victim of cyanide toxicity. You'd also have to grind the pits up in your teeth to make them effective. Cherry, peach, and apricot pits can also cause harm, so watch out for them. The UK's Independent reported in 2017 that a father of 3 almost died in the hospital after he decided to try the pits in the cherries he was eating. The young man wasn't aware of the possibility of cyanide poisoning. He ate 3 pits in all. He told the press after eating the first one he decided they were actually very tasty and so had another 2 pits. It tasted similar to an almond but with a cherry flavor to it. I didn't think anything of it, just thought it was a seed, so I ate it and continued to eat more of it, the man told the press. He then started to burn up and feel rather unwell. He was then rushed to the hospital. Bananas, it seems, are the least of our fruit-based worry.
Plant life affects our own life in many different ways. From the cotton clothes we wear, to the fruit we eat, the air we breathe, to the flowers we give as romantic gifts to our significant others. Green life matters from the very bottom of the food chain to the very top. Plants also dictate Earth's climate and the habitats we live in. Can you imagine a life without plants? Is such a thing possible? And what kind of disaster could turn the world into a barren, dark desert void of plant life? Would the world still keep turning without plants? Can we live without them? Join us in this plant life apocalypse as we consider what might happen if all plant life suddenly disappeared. In today's infographic show, what if all the plants in the world died? First, what could cause such an event? Well, let's say the sun plunged away from the Earth and the planet was shrouded in darkness. In this case, plants would not be able to live. Being starved of their light energy source, they would no longer grow and reproduce. On the other hand, if the Earth suddenly heated up dramatically, plants would also suffer being unable to function and grow under intense heat. So in cases of lack of light or intense heat, plant life would quickly go extinct. And what would that mean? A world without plants? What would happen? Well, the Earth would become a much quieter place, as all living creatures need plants for food, and most living things would become extinct without plants existing at the bottom of the food chain. Would everything on Earth die if plants disappeared? Experts have some different views on just what would happen, but the general consensus is that we'd all die eventually. Let's look at oxygen. We breathe in oxygen and exhale carbon dioxide. The air around us contains around 21% oxygen and 0.04% carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide becomes dangerous at around 1% of the air mass. As we all know, plants produce oxygen via a process called photosynthesis. Most of us remember learning at school that photosynthesis converts light energy into chemical energy, and it's this process that plants use to grow. Once this process stops, most plants would die swiftly, although some plant matter might hold out longer depending on how much sugar they had stored. Larger trees, for example, would be able to last longer than a smaller shrub. But once the process of photosynthesis stops, plant life will ultimately die. And here's the kicker. Once photosynthesis stops, the population of animals would face a serious problem. A fast depleting food source would occur almost overnight. Lack of oxygen would at first glance seem to pose a serious threat, but in reality, it isn't the lack of oxygen from plants that would cause the initial threat to all life if plants were to kick the bucket. According to NASA calculations, the average human being requires 840 grams of oxygen per day. The Earth's atmosphere holds around 1,000 billion tons of oxygen, and the total world population is 7.5 billion, meaning that we would last another 370 years based on current reserves. Animal life would also require oxygen, but with plant life dying, animal life would be swift to follow. Death by lack of oxygen is not what will actually kill us in the worldwide plant death, as the atmosphere alone holds enough oxygen to sustain life on the planet for years. But there's also oxygen in the ground and inside ice. Scientists estimate that the oxygen atmospheric content would be exhausted after 52,535 years if the population of animals remained constant. So the lack of oxygen would not be the major problem. Instead, the main concern would be the devastation of all our food webs. Once the green plants are gone, each and every animal that feeds on the green stuff will also die. Herbivores would die from starvation in a few weeks. That would mean most of our domestic farm animals reared for human consumption would disappear if we humans didn't have adequate supplies of food to feed them. We would have to make a decision to either feed our livestock or feed ourselves. If some seeds and fruits remained in the trees, birds would last a little longer, but they would be fair game to the humans looking for an easy meal. Carrion eaters such as vultures, crows, and hyenas would have one almighty feast before also slipping out of the ecosystem. Carnivores would have to eat each other as they naturally do, and again we'd have a feeding frenzy on our hands. By the calculations of Nick Canning of Coraline, the time for the animal population to die out would be 13.75 years, meaning life on Earth would collapse during most of our lifetimes. Humans being on the top of the food chain will ultimately suffer too, but would probably be the last of the Earth mammal species to expire. People in developed nations would be likely the first to die, as they don't live off the land and would have to rely on stored resources. People in developing nations will get to survive on their crop reserves for a limited period of time. But what would happen to the conditions on Earth? For starters, it would become a much hotter place to live. Without plant life, levels of greenhouse gases would increase and temperatures would rise. The water cycle would be affected. Plants take in rain and snowfall and release moisture back into the atmosphere. precipitation patterns would change dramatically. Without plants to hold soil to the land, the soil would be washed away into the sea, leaving much of the planet resembling a hot, barren, muddy desert. Following a few months, the only edible food left would be fungi living on dead vegetation. It would become one giant mushroom hunt for those remaining survivors. These fungi could provide humans with food, but mushrooms lack essential vitamins, such as vitamin C, and eventually fungi would also disappear as the dead matter from which they feed erodes away. Once at this stage, humans would probably be the only mammals left on the planet owing to our food storing habits. Rodents may also coexist if they have access to human food stores, so we may have a world where humans become rodent eaters and perhaps even turn to cannibalism in an attempt to survive. But maybe things could be better at sea. What about the ocean? If only green plants disappeared, there may exist in the ocean microscopic algae, bacteria, and phytoplankton. These aquatic plants are right at the bottom of the food chain and may be our saviors. So in theory, life could remain and evolve in the oceans. But as a human food source, fish, crustaceans, and other aquatic sea life would only support a small fraction of the human population. Humans killing each other in a fight for the resources that remain in the sea is a real possibility, but there could be a chance for those hardy survivors to find a new way of life using the resources of the ocean. Water could be used as a means to create oxygen using electrolysis to split water molecules into oxygen and hydrogen, with the oxygen released into the atmosphere to breathe and hydrogen used for the chemosynthesis of food. That would mean the potential oxygen crisis and the food shortage epidemic could be solved for those few who survive the plant death epidemic. A woman's sitting in her apartment watching TV when she smells something that puts her off her macaroni and cheese dinner. She can't quite work out what the smell is, but the first two things that come to mind are rotten eggs and rotten cabbage. She's tired, so she goes to bed. But when she wakes up the next morning, that awful smell is even stronger. The stink is so bad that she gags. It feels as if somewhere in the house rats are decaying in one big heap. Then she notices that the smell seems to be coming from the apartment next door. That's enough to make her call the cops, even though the young guy who lives next door looks healthy and nowhere near his expiration date. When the cops enter that apartment, they too gag when they see the bloated corpse in front of them. Let's now go back in time. That guy that died was named Jack. His neighbor was right about him regarding her assumption that he was fit and healthy. His downfall was the fact that he worked out too much. Jack had injured himself and he had to take very strong pain medications following an ambitious attempt to clean and jerk much more than his own body weight. This was Jack's downfall because those medications brought on severe and chronic constipation. Jack put up with it as best he could, but over time his large bowel extended because of such a large buildup of feces. This led to compression in his chest cavity, and that resulted in him dying from sudden cardiac arrest. We know this because a pathologist performed an autopsy on him. We'll soon get back to that autopsy, but first, let's have a look at Jack's last gasp of air in this world. When Jack's heart failed him, what happened next was his brain didn't receive the blood flow it needed to function. He passed out, and after a few minutes, something called global cerebral ischemia happened. That's the term used for when the entire brain isn't getting any blood flow. Then Jack experienced something called brain death. He checked out and there was no coming back. He jerked around a bit, but that was just the last bit of brain activity performing its last dance. Now it gets messy. What happened next is Jack's body began the first phase of its post-death performance. This is known as primary flaccidity, and it basically means that all his muscles relaxed. At this point, his jaw dropped open by itself. Around the same time, that coffee he drunk in the morning bloomed at the front of his pants in the form of urine. As for that backed up feces he'd never been able to eject, that left his sphincter and made a big mess on the couch where he was sitting in his underwear. Jack then started to turn a shade of white, which is something in the death business they call pallor mortis. It's the process of the blood draining from the veins. This usually happens at around the 20-minute mark. Next up for Jack was the stage known as algor mortis, which is when the body starts to cool down. The human body is quite the toasty environment and usually has a temperature reading of anywhere from 97 degrees Fahrenheit to 99 degrees Fahrenheit. When someone is dead, that temperature will drop and level out at the temperature of the surroundings. Jack left his window open, so it was chilly in the room. This actually slowed down his decomposition, but it also opened a door to insects, who saw Jack as an ideal host for their eggs. What happens around that time is blood starts to pool where it can. With Jack's heart not pumping blood around his body, it's gravity that rules blood flow. In Jack's case, he was lying face down, so the blood started to pool as gravity pulled it down. This process, called livor mortis, starts at only about 20 minutes, but those purple patches on the body usually start to form at around the 2-hour mark. They become more pronounced as time goes on. Jack sat like this for a while, and then after about 4 hours, his muscles started to get very rigid, and he started to look pretty damn scary. This is the part of the process called rigor mortis. It's basically due to biochemical changes in the body. Jack's mouth was all twisted. He looked like someone who died after seeing a ghost. But it's actually a myth that people die with expressions of fear on their faces. The weird, sometimes pained expression is just the body going through the rigor mortis process. That process starts with the eyelids, hence those scary open eyes you see on dead people. It moves all the way down the body until it reaches the toes. Jack's body was extremely stiff at the 12-hour mark, at which point it would have been hard to move his limbs around. He remained looking like a statue for a good 2 days, which is quite normal. After that, his body started decaying some more, and the stiffness gave way to another relaxation stage known as secondary flaccidity. It's at this stage that the skin starts to shrink a bit, and if you'd seen Jack at this point, you might have thought his hair and nails were growing. That wasn't happening, it was just his skin receding. Okay, so Jack's been dead over 2 days now. He's pooped his pants, he's relaxed, and he's stiffened, and then he's relaxed again. Now it's time for the massacre, what some people call the cannibalization of the body. It depends on the temperature, but in general, people will start to show the signs of decomposition after around 3 days. People start decomposing pretty much as soon as they die, but it usually takes a few days for that decomposition to start making the dead look very dead. You see, Jack's body used to be maintained when it was a living organism. But when Jack died, his immune system no longer worked, and all that bacteria in his gut and elsewhere were free to explore his body. You could say that Jack started eating himself. Protein started decomposing, and all that bacteria started to digest his body. This stage of decomposition just made Jack turn a shade of green at the beginning, but it soon started to make him look pretty ugly and smell really bad. After about 5 days, Jack started to bloat and blisters formed at various points on his body. What was happening is he was fermenting, and that's because the feeding bacteria was creating gases in the body. It's generally what happens when you ferment stuff, including the human body. It's why a dead body sometimes emits a foul stench through its mouth. That gas has got to go somewhere. If you want to know why dead bodies smell so bad, you need to know what gases are emitted from the corpse. One called cadaverine is renowned for having the malodor of rotten fish. Putrescine also has notes of dead fish. Scatole smells like poo. Hydrogen sulfide smells like rotten eggs. Dimethyl disulfide smells like acrid garlic mixed with dead fish. And methane thiol has the distinct smell of rotten cabbage. Altogether, this medley of gases makes dead people not the best folks to have around as housemates. After around 12 days, parts of Jack's body were turning black and those terrible smells were worsening. This is about the time that his neighbor first noticed the stench. What the cops found at the scene was what's known as an unattended death. These can be viewed as suspicious deaths, so the first thing law enforcement wanted to know is if natural causes were to blame. Only around 5% of deaths in the US require an autopsy, and Jack was one of those. The medical examiner received Jack's body along with notes written by people who'd seen him in his apartment. The note said he was sitting on the couch and that there was nothing at the scene that suggested foul play or suicide. The pathologist also had information about Jack's medical history, so he saw that Jack had been prescribed strong painkillers. This was a big deal, of course. The examiner then got to work, externally going over the body from head to toe to look for anything that could suggest the cause of death. There was nothing remarkable to see there, so the examiner opened Jack up after cutting him from his sternum to his pubic bone. Jack was still a little bloated, so the examiner had to take a step back when some gas escaped from the body. Once he cut through the skin, fat, and muscles, the examiner opened Jack's rib cage. He actually used a pair of shears to do this, a tool not unlike ordinary garden shears. Now that he has the keys to the kingdom, he could start removing Jack's organs. The first removal saw Jack's heart, lungs, throat, and tongue go. Then he took out the stomach, liver, and the pancreas, followed by the bladder, bowels, and reproductive organs. The tricky bit can be removing the tongue without causing a scar that will upset the grieving family and friends. But every medical examiner knows how to get to the tongue without making a visible scar someone will see later. So now Jack's hardly himself at all as the examiner looks at, weighs, and slices open various organs. He's pretty much looking for anything out of the ordinary, and in Jack's case it was pretty obvious what had happened. Once the cause of death was determined, Jack's organs were put back into his body and he was sewn up. The reconstruction job doesn't mean everything goes back perfectly into place, far from it. but an examiner will put the organs close to where they came from. In some cases, the organs may be kept for research, or they might be cremated if the family gives their consent. All we can say is that Jack got his back. The examiner signed the death certificate and completed the form so Jack could be buried. It must be said that because Jack had spent quite a lot of time decomposing on the couch, he looked pretty rough, even for a corpse. Now we come to the funeral home where Jack will spend a little bit of time before his big day. The first thing that happened there was the spa treatment. This consisted of washing the body and making sure all his limbs were lying in the right place. Jack didn't need much limb massaging because the rigor mortis stage had already passed. His eyelids were then closed with glue and his jaw was wired shut. After a little bit more tinkering with his mouth, he was made to look as though he was resting in peace. Next up was the embalmment, which consisted of removing Jack's blood and pumping him full of chemicals to preserve his body. After that, Jack's abdomen was drained, as was his chest cavity, and once that happened, the embalming chemicals were pumped in. The last thing was to make Jack look presentable to those who'd see him in his open casket, so makeup was used to give him more of a glow than he had when he went into the funeral home. His hair was styled, his nasal hair cropped, and his nails were cut. He was then dressed and placed in a coffin, ready for the big send-off. Ashes to ashes, dust to dust, and Jack was in the ground. What next? The answer is a lot of waiting. If Jack had just been left to rot above ground in the open air, things would have been different. There, he would have been feasted on by insects, and within a matter of weeks, he would have very likely become a liquefied mess. It's a different story 6 feet under, embalmed and housed in a wooden box. How a person will decompose depends on a lot of factors. Those factors include what kind of coffin someone's sealed in, the environment in which the coffin is placed, and also the body of the person that has died. After just a few weeks underground, Jack no longer had any kind of greenish complexion and instead, he had dark brown tint to his skin. That nice suit he wore to his own funeral was hanging off him after a few months, and once a year had passed, there wasn't much of it left. This doesn't mean that the suit was badly made, but that the suit was being degraded by the fluids coming out of Jack. 10 years have now passed, and Jack is now on his way to becoming human soup, which isn't a very good look for him. Things could have been very different. Some bodies have been exhumed after many years and they didn't look too different from when they were buried. You just don't know what you're gonna get when you open a coffin that's been dug up. For instance, if the body is buried in very dry conditions, it could mummify, which is probably a nice outcome if you're an exhumer by trade. It might take years, but there's no getting away from the fact that one day we will all become a skeleton if we're not specially preserved. So that's the story of Unlucky Jack. But it's also partly the story of most people on this planet. We all have the same ticket for the same destination, although none of us know when our bus is due. The rat-a-tat-tat of the drums lures people to follow the prisoner cart, slowly rolling through the streets of Sydney. 2 condemned men are going to be executed this morning. Thief James Hardwick and 23-year-old thief and murderer Joseph Samuel. By the time the cart reaches the gallows near Brickfield Hill, a large crowd is gathered. They don't yet know that they're about to witness something unusual and that the events of the day will long be remembered. Reverend Samuel Marsden administers last rites to Hardwick. An elder of the Jewish community, Joseph Marcus, who would later become Australia's first rabbi, performs rites for Samuel. Then the men are asked if they wish to confess. Samuel pleads his case, pointing out a man in the crowd, Isaac Simmons, as the real killer. Some people in the crowd are riled up after Samuel's impassioned speech, but the execution continues. At 10 a.m., Samuel and Hardwick step up onto the cart and have nooses placed around their necks. Here's where accounts differ. Some say that Hardwick received a last-minute pardon and Samuel was left to face his maker alone. Others claim that Hardwick was indeed executed, and due to a bizarre twist of fate, he was the only one executed on this day. Either way, standing on the cart seconds from death, a terrified Samuel begins to quietly pray. The executioner slaps the horse's rump. The horse trots forward, and the cart pulls out from beneath Samuel's feet. In 1795, at age 15, Joseph Samuel was sentenced to 7 years of imprisonment for larceny in England. In 1801, he was transported to Australia to serve out the remainder of his sentence. Samuel was imprisoned in the penal settlement at Sydney Cove in the colony of New South Wales. In addition to the harsh security of the prison camp, it was purposely miles from out of town. The guards figured that if a man was able to escape, the hostile outback would take care of him before he could make his way back to civilization. However, Samuel did escape and survive. Eventually, he made it to Sydney and took up with a gang of thieves. On the night of August 25, 1803, they robbed the home of a wealthy woman, Mrs. Mary Breeze. Among other items, they stole 24 guineas and several silver dollars. A constable on patrol in the area, Joseph Lucker, investigated. The next morning, Constable Lucker was found stabbed to death, becoming the first police officer killed in the line of duty in Australia. The gang of thieves was quickly hunted down and captured. Samuel had some of the stolen coins in his pocket when he was arrested. Also, Mrs. Breeze identified him as one of the culprits. When interrogated, Samuel confessed the robbery, but claimed to have nothing to do with the murder. Still, he was tried and convicted. The other suspects were banished from the colonies or acquitted. Even though they were caught with blood on their clothes, 2 other suspects, Isaac Simmons and William Blatters, were acquitted due to insufficient evidence and their explanations. Simmons claimed that he was prone to nosebleeds, and Blatters said he had recently slaughtered a pig. The morning of the execution, Simmons was escorted by police to watch the hanging, in the hopes that he would be frightened enough to confess. At the time in Australia, death by hanging was brutal. The more merciful drop hanging, where a convict drops through a hole and their neck is quickly snapped, hadn't yet been instituted. Instead, a condemned person stands on a cart. Once the noose is placed around their neck, the horse would pull away with the cart. Thus, the condemned would be left dangling and slowly strangled to death. As Samuels gets up on the cart, he's scared. His accusation of Isaac Simmons has angered some in the crowd, but not stopped the proceedings as he'd hoped. Samuel prays as a noose is slid around his neck. The executioner slaps the horse's rump. The horse trots forward and the cart pulls out from beneath Samuel's feet. He painfully dangles for a moment, and then the rope around Samuel's neck inexplicably breaks, causing him to drop to the ground, spraining his ankle. Another rope is brought, and for a second time Samuel stands on the cart. Again, a noose is placed around his neck. And this time, when the horse pulls the cart away, the noose unravels, extending the rope enough to allow Samuel's boots to touch the ground. By now, the crowd is uneasy. Not only has this man passionately proclaimed his innocence, but mysteriously, twice now, the executioner has failed to kill him. Some people shout for Samuels to be released, claiming that divine intervention is saving him. Nevertheless, a third rope is fetched. This time, the authorities quickly inspect the rope before making a noose. It's a standard rope made of 5 thick cords of hemp. It should be able to hold around 1,000 pounds without breaking. For the third time, Samuel is placed on the cart, a noose around his neck. The horse is slapped and pulls the cart away. Incredibly, the rope breaks again. Samuel falls face first into the ground and is briefly knocked unconscious. By now, the crowd is rowdy. They clamor for Samuel to be released. The provost marshal orders the execution to be delayed and gallops off on horseback to report the unbelievable series of events to Governor King. He comes back with the stay of execution. The governor has granted Samuel a reprieve. You would think that after his crazy brush with death, Samuel might straighten up and become a model citizen. But no, he didn't. Samuel was taken to the doctor for injuries received during the botched execution. He fully recovered. His sentence was converted to life in prison, and he was sent to Kingstown, which later became Newcastle, to work in the coal mines. In 1806, Samuel and 7 other men escaped the settlement, sailing off in a boat during a storm. They were never heard from again. All were presumed lost at sea. Isaac Simmons was convicted and hung for the murder of Constable Lucker. However, today, Constable Lucker's murder is considered to be Australia's oldest cold case with no definitive proof as to the murderer. The date is July 22, 1969, and for the last 21 hours and 36 minutes, America, and the world at large, has been glued to its television sets, watching the incredible exploits of humanity's first steps on another world. The culmination of thousands of years of mankind's dreams and fantasies to reach past the bounds of Earth and touch the heavens. The American moon landing has ushered a new age of humanity and signaled the first brave steps of our civilization into the universe. Live updates on the mission have poured over televisions and radios around the world, and from time to time, glimpses of this historic mission have made their way back home to Earth. Now, the world awaits the return of these bravest of men, ready to be welcomed back home, not just as American heroes, but heroes for all the world. Suddenly, though, television screens all over the globe cut from the non-stop news coverage of the historic moon landing to the White House, where a somber-looking President Nixon stares directly into the camera. With a faltering start, he clears his throat and begins to speak. Fate has ordained that men who went to the moon to explore in peace will stay on the moon to rest in peace. These brave men, Neil Armstrong and Edwin Aldrin, know that there's no hope for their recovery, but they also know that there is hope for mankind in their sacrifice. The president continues, finally nearing the end of his speech. In ancient days, men looked at the stars and saw their heroes in the constellations. In modern times, we do much the same, but our heroes are epic men of flesh and blood. Others will follow and surely find their way home. Man's search will not be denied, but these men were first, and they will remain the foremost in our hearts. For every human being who looks up at the moon in the nights to come will know that there is some corner of another world that is forever mankind. The screen cuts to the massive mission control room in NASA, the place where the hopes and dreams of every nation on Earth has rested for the last 6 days. With battery power failing on the lunar lander, communications with the men trapped on the moon are near an end. Finally, the two brave astronauts make their final goodbye to their loved ones and the world at large, imploring that the world should not mourn for them, but be inspired for their many accomplishments. The radio cuts out. The lander's gone dark. Trapped on the surface of the moon, the men will continue to have a few hours worth of oxygen, but will soon suffocate if they don't freeze to death first. On TV screens around the world, a priest appears live from inside the historic St. John's Episcopal Church in Washington, D.C. The father commends the souls of Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin to the deepest of the deep, much as if he were conducting a burial at sea for fallen sailors. Then he finishes with the Lord's Prayer. The previous scenario was a very real possibility and a carefully crafted response should the historic Apollo 11 suffer some form of catastrophic failure and be unable to return to the Earth. Given the incredible number of unknowns involved in the mission, from the suitability of the lunar surface for a heavy lander to touch down on, to an unknown environmental hazard on the moon and their effects on men and equipment, NASA and the American government had made every preparation for the first manned moon landing to end in disaster. The real Apollo 11, of course, ended in a historic victory for all of mankind and signaled America's triumph over its Soviet rivals in the space race. Yet at many points throughout the mission, failure was only ever a heartbeat away. For example, when the lander undocked from the command module, the lander received a tiny bit of thrust from venting gases in the docking tunnel. While minor, in the weightless state of the spacecraft in orbit, this small amount of thrust actually placed the lander 4 nautical miles away from the point it was supposed to be when it was to begin its descent burn. In turn, this placed the planned landing site amidst a dangerous boulder field on the rim of a crater. Armstrong was famously forced to eyeball the landing and burned his fuel reserves dangerously low in doing so, but found a suitable landing spot nonetheless. What if the astronauts had died on the moon though? What if you died in space today? What would happen to your body, and how would NASA respond? If Armstrong and Aldrin had died on the moon, there were already plans in the US government to designate the site an official memorial. That meant that the site would be off limits to anybody else in the future. In essence, the astronauts' bodies would remain forever undisturbed inside their spacecraft for all eternity, or at least until the sun swallows the Earth and Moon up as it becomes a red giant one day. Even in some far-off future where the US or other nations had significant lunar presence, recovery of the bodies would be off limits. How much would be left of the bodies is debatable though. If the lunar module had not suffered any penetration of its hull, and the astronauts died, say, because of a power failure or a failure to ignite their ascent engine and return to the command module, then there would remain an atmosphere within the lunar module. This would also be true if the astronauts had simply stayed inside their spacesuits. In that case, bacteria would have begun to decompose the body much the same as they do here on Earth, using up the remaining oxygen in the atmosphere. There may not have been enough oxygen to keep humans alive, but there would have been enough for bacteria to thrive for a short while. When the oxygen ran out, however, bacterial respiration would switch to fermentation, and the process of decomposing would continue much as here on Earth, at least for a short while. The lunar lander was equipped with multiple layers of mylar insulation to help keep the heat of the sun from cooking the astronauts to death and destroying sensitive equipment, while other parts that wanted to receive warmth from the sun were coated in darker, more heat-absorbent materials. This ultimately would have seen the lunar lander very quickly go cold, and as the lander froze on the inside, so would the astronauts. How much decomposition would take place before all bacteria froze or suffocated to death is unknown, but the remains would likely remain very recognizable to future archaeologists who visited the site. What happens though if you die on a spacewalk? Let's say you're hanging out on the outside of the International Space Station and suddenly, through some error, you're blown clear of the ISS. With no hope of rescue, you suffocate within a few short hours. In this scenario, bacteria would begin to consume you much the same as on the moon scenario, as your suit will still retain an atmosphere for bacteria to thrive in. Eventually, the bacteria would die off, though you'd probably remain pretty warm for a long time, as your remains would remain exposed to sunlight. While space itself is cold, objects can be pretty warm thanks to the non-stop glare of the sun, and the lack of an atmosphere means that heat cannot be easily leached away the same way it does here on Earth. On a chilly winter day, your body's heat is steadily leached away by the atmosphere it's constantly in contact with. But in a vacuum, there's no medium to wick heat away from the body. This is why heat management is vitally important for all spacecraft and satellites. Eventually though, the blast of never-ending radiation from the sun and passing cosmic rays would begin to destroy the integrity of your spacesuit. Over the course of a few months to a few years, the spacesuit will eventually suffer a structural failure, and with your suit being full of your decomposing gases, it'll promptly explode as air rapidly expands due to the leak. You'll then litter your personal orbit with chunky bits of your leftover flesh and spacesuit both, like a gross overripe meat balloon that burst open. Space is risky business, and NASA has already planned on what to do about fatalities during one of its missions. During the age of the space shuttle, a crew fatality would be dealt with much in the same way that a current fatality would be handed aboard the International Space Station. The dead crew member would be very quickly placed inside a pressurized spacesuit and sealed inside, and then moved to the coldest part of the spacecraft for storage. This would be done to protect the rest of the crew and ship from contamination, and because dead bodies are, well, if you've ever been around anyone who's died, then you know it can be a messy affair, even if they die peacefully. In a zero-G environment, you really don't want to be dealing with the waste, stomach contents, and gases that would be voiding from the corpse. Aboard the space shuttle, the body would then simply be returned to Earth for a proper burial. Aboard the ISS, though, things would be a little trickier, as obviously the crew can't return whenever they feel like it. There, the body would likely be moved to an airlock so it could remain as cold as possible and preserved for a proper burial back home, and then could be placed inside one of the unmanned resupply craft that routinely visits the ISS. On a longer voyage though, say like a trip to Mars, NASA has to be prepared to handle crew fatalities as well. While astronauts are carefully selected to avoid any potential health issues that could cause a space fatality, sometimes tragedy is simply unpredictable, and there are plenty of hazards out there in space waiting to claim lives. An extremely long-duration mission such as a trip to Mars is rife with possibilities for disaster, and fatalities must be planned for. In this situation, how to deal with a fatality would likely fall on the mission commander. Much like in the ISS, a fatality could simply be stored in a suit and then kept in an airlock, but mission constraints may not make that a feasible option. With such a long-duration mission, there's simply no way the crew could keep the body around indefinitely, both for practical reasons such as possible contamination from a suit failure, but also for morale reasons. In this event, simply jettisoning the body into space may be necessary. The spacecraft itself would likely be in an orbit, which would have it enter partially into the Martian atmosphere in order to help it slow down enough to get caught by Mars's gravity, instead of simply being slingshotted into orbit around the sun again. This means that the body would likely burn up in the Martian atmosphere, being much lighter and smaller than the spacecraft itself. So if the astronauts wanted the body to have any chance of recovery by future space travelers, then it would have to be ejected with enough force to alter its trajectory and avoid burning up in Mars's atmosphere. As long as the spacecraft was far enough away from Mars, this could very easily be accomplished and require minimal thrust. The body would remain in orbit around the sun, and in a century or two could be recoverable by future space archaeologists wishing to give it a proper burial. If you were to die on the surface of another planet though, then much like dying en route there, what happens to you would likely end up being the choice of the mission commander. If feasible, you may be stuffed into a suit and returned with the rest of the astronauts for burial at home. But likely, whatever foreign body you happen to be on at the time would end up being your permanent resting place. In order to avoid contaminating another planet with Earth life though, your body would need to be thoroughly cremated, something which may prove difficult to do on an early mission to Mars or another planet, but which would be critical. Someone, someday, is bound to die during a space mission, and what to do with their remains when they do is of vital importance, not just for the safety and comfort of the crew, but for the bereaved family members back home, and the world whose hopes and dreams rested in them. Hopefully we don't have to find out what NASA actually does with a dead crew member in space for a long time, but it's good to know that they're at least prepared to handle this eventuality.
Today we are broaching a topic that may not be the merriest of things to talk about. Nevertheless, it's something we all do think about. How will we be taken from this existence? If you've made it this far, you're doing okay. Infant mortality rates differ from region to region, but for the most part, many more babies get to the age of 5 than in the past. The WHO tells us that 41% of infants that don't make it to age 5 die at birth, which is 3.3 million deaths from a total of 8.2 million under 5 deaths around the world. Those first 4 weeks of your life are tense, but if you survive those, the odds are good for clocking in for many more years to come. Today we'll look at how you'll probably go in this episode of the Infographic Show, This Is How You Will Die. Don't forget to subscribe and click the bell button so that you can be part of our notification squad. First of all, we should point out that region to region and country to country, the probability of you dying one way or another will change. If you are a Japanese man, your life is expected to reach 78.8 years old on average, and if you are a Japanese woman, 85.5. This is the highest life expectancy on the planet. You can read a number of articles on why this is, and most put it down to a healthy diet of vegetables and fish that usually comes in small portions, as well as elderly citizens enjoying exercise and usually not being left to fester in old people's homes. An observer in Japan will also note these people are hardworking and at times have a propensity for drinking alcohol and smoking cigarettes. According to Japanese health data, smoking is the third biggest risk factor behind disease, as well as high blood pressure and dietary risks. The data said that in 2016, the 3 leading causes of death in Japan were senile dementia/Alzheimer's, heart disease, and cerebrovascular disease. If you are young though, it's a different matter. It has been reported that in Japan, suicide is the leading cause of death among men aged 20 to 44. Statistically, if you eat the average Japanese diet, don't smoke, and can find ways to circumvent or deal with life's woes, you will very likely get old in Japan. Vehicle deaths, drug overdoses, and crime-related deaths are very common in this large country, unlike many other prosperous nations. The continent of Africa has some of the lowest life expectancy rates per country. The lowest of them all is Sierra Leone, which has an average life expectancy of just 50.1. The other countries with life expectancy rates in the early 50s are Angola, Central African Republic, Chad, Ivory Coast, and Lesotho. Unfortunately, many of the leading causes of death in these regions are preventable. These are nutritional deficiencies, pneumonia, diarrheal diseases, anemia, malaria, tuberculosis, and HIV/AIDS, with malaria being the biggest killer of all. The fact that so many people do not receive adequate health care, do not have adequate sanitation or clean drinking water, or enough money for a substantial diet means disease can easily spread. Statistically, the stark truth is that being poor will most likely finish you off in some of the countries we mentioned here. This lies in juxtaposition to many countries in what we call first world nations. In Africa, the high death rate at a young age might be a consequence of not having enough, but in places such as the United States, the death rate can often be correlated to having too much. So, let's have a look at death in the USA. We will go into more detail here due to the fact that many of our viewers are from the US, but also because death rates there mirror some other developed nations. According to the Center for Disease Control, right now in the US, a country with an average life expectancy of 81.5 for women and 77 for men, the most likely way for you to go is by heart disease. 633,842 people died from heart disease according to a report published in 2016. That's about 1 in every 5 Americans meeting the reaper due to a faulty ticker. Next on the list is cancer at 595,930 deaths, followed by chronic lower respiratory disease at 155,041 deaths, accidents at 146,571 deaths, stroke or cerebrovascular disease at 140,323 deaths, Alzheimer's disease at 110,561 deaths, diabetes at 79,535 deaths, influenza and pneumonia at 57,062 deaths, kidney disease at 49,959 deaths, and suicide at 44,193 deaths. In case you were wondering, although gun crime and murders often take up the headlines, the FBI reported that in 2016, 17,250 murders occurred in the US. That was 8.8% more than in 2015. Another headline maker has been drug-related deaths in the USA, much in part due to the rise of prescribed opioids that have hit the streets over the last few years. The United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime reports that Americans are by far the biggest consumers of opioids, followed by Canada and Germany a ways behind. The New York Times just reported that ODs are now the leading cause of accidental death in the USA. The Times wrote that the CDC hasn't come up with the exact figure yet for 2016, but, said the Times, expect it to be the biggest ever recorded at 59,000 deaths by opiate OD, which is now the leading cause of death among Americans under 50. You heard that right. If you are not at the half-century mark yet, you are most likely to die from overdoing it with drugs such as heroin, fentanyl, or OxyContin. Motor vehicle deaths in the USA in 2016 accounted for 37,461 deaths. So if we add that to the 59,000 overdose deaths and the 17,250 murders, we have 113,711 deaths in 2016. We won't get too political, but we could say that all these deaths might be preventable with changes in legislation. While the drugs, guns, and fast cars are still flowing in the American mainstream, if you don't want to die under 50, then perhaps you should give them all a wide berth. Still, what are the causes of all the heart disease and cancer in the US? According to the CDC, a lot of heart disease related deaths could be prevented too, and a big part of that is the notoriously terrible diet that many Americans enjoy. Watch your cholesterol, exercise, eat healthy, don't drink too much booze, watch the pounds, and the CD says you might just avoid heart disease. But then cancer takes out almost as many American folks. What to do about that? According to the American Cancer Society, cancer can come by dint of your genetics, so you might not be able to avoid it. You can, however, eat well and get all the right nutrients to keep your body healthy and able to fight off disease. Exercise, stay away from abusive behavior, and try not to get sunburned every day. According to a report in Live Science, 73 is the median age of cancer death, so don't get too worried just yet. While we may not be able to hide from the big C, medical science tells us diet and bad habits, and especially obesity, can be a fast track towards getting the disease. The total number of deaths in the USA in 2016 was 2,626,418, and almost half of those were due to heart disease and cancer. Is that just normal in most nations? If we look at the Brits, like America, a fast food society with alarming obesity rates, they have much higher rates of heart disease than their food-loving neighbors, the French. There is a lot of speculation as to why this is, but it's thought the French eat better, stay thinner, and binge less. Because the French also enjoy a high-fat diet and are partial to wine, researchers have called their low rate of heart disease the French paradox. Medical professionals are still disagreeing over this paradox, just as monthly, the public is told this or that is bad for them, and then a month later, it turns out eggs are actually good, and a glass of wine a day keeps the doctor away. What we can tell you is that it seems that moderation in life is the key to longevity, as well as exercising the body and mind. Stay healthy and don't die on us.
If you've been following our channel a while, you'll know that there are a lot of hidden dangers in the world, some of which you regularly drink. If you look at the British tabloid media in 2013, you might find a story that tells you a man literally drank himself to death. And no, it wasn't alcohol. The poor guy just drank 3 liters of cola a day and topped it up with water. His lungs swelled after a binge and it was game over for him. There was a similar story in the UK a year before about a woman who drank 18 pints of cola a day, which was blamed for her early demise. Even drinking too much water too fast can lead to a very painful death. But today we get stranger. In this episode of the Infographics Show, how drinking milk can kill you. Before we tell you how this happens, we'll tell you about the most famous victim of milk death. Her name was Nancy Hanks Lincoln, and she was the mother of the famous former American president Abraham Lincoln. She died of what was called milk sickness on October 5, 1818, at the age of 34. Little Abraham was just 9 years old when she passed. While these days you don't exactly hear about people dying from drinking milk, back then, thousands of people in the Midwest got milk sickness and died. We found one article on the News Watchman website that told us this. The history of milk sickness shows that it was first reported in Ohio about 1810 by Dr. Daniel Drake of Cincinnati. The Ohio Public Health Journal said in 1917, so prevalent was the disease at one time in Ohio that it seriously interfered with migration and development of the state. Home seekers going west would avoid Ohio on account of it. As the U.S. National Park Service explains, when people went down with milk sickness in those days, it was very much a mystery. Nobody in the beginning knew what was happening. It was kind of a boogeyman ailment that looked different from other sicknesses of the time. That's because people were in fact being poisoned by a plant called white snakeroot. The plant has lots of different names, including milk sickness plant, fall poison, deerwort boneset, white sanicle, and Indian sanicle. You can find it in different parts of the USA, but it's most common in Indiana, Illinois, and Ohio. What would happen is that cows would eat the plant, and then people would drink the milk from the cow. The meat can also become contaminated. A Dr. Anna Pierce Hobbs Bixby first revealed this strange sickness was down to the white snakeroot plant. As the legend goes, she was told by a Shawnee woman. Fewer people died when word got around. Apparently that took some time back then, because wooded areas were cleared and farm animals wouldn't be in the vicinity of any white snakeroot. White snakeroot contains tramadol, which is toxic to animals and humans. Very toxic. We looked at a research paper we found on this toxin and how it would affect people when they'd ingested it by accident. Apparently, you don't just keel over. The symptoms are gradual. First, you feel a bit restless, and you might have sore muscles. Soon, you won't be able to eat, be able to poo, and then you will start throwing up. You may also start trembling a lot, have bad breath, and suffer from delirium. The sickness was sometimes called the trembles. Early settlers also called it the puking sickness and the slows. Tramadol disrupts glucose metabolism. Energy is disrupted, and so that's why muscles seize and people tremble. One scientific paper said as the amount of tramadol accumulates, probably in the liver, the metabolic engine is gradually shut down, and the acidity of ketones results in ketoacidosis, which is life-threatening. If you show symptoms, coma and death will likely follow about 2 to 3 weeks later. Some people do survive, but they are lucky. If you happen to have a cow or goat in your keeping and suddenly it won't move, goes very stiff, has muscle spasms, or stands with an arched back, you may want to give its milk a pass until you've had it checked out. This killer plant might still be the end of an animal's life, but it is unlikely to kill a human these days. Why is that? First, the last case we could find was when 2 very young children were admitted to the St. Louis, Missouri hospital in 1963. They were both diagnosed with milk sickness. The articles don't say if the kids survived. They had drunk milk from a cow that had eaten white snake root. But could it still happen today? While pasteurization wouldn't get rid of the contamination, it's the way we produce milk on an industrial scale that's the reason we don't hear about milk sickness today. You see, you don't usually drink milk from a single cow. As one person pointed out on a forum, milk is often delivered in tanks of trucks carrying around 5,000 gallons of milk. So you need many cows to fill that tank. As the milk gets mixed, even if one cow had eaten white snake root, you wouldn't be dangerously contaminated when you had your cereal, as the milk would contain the tiniest amount of tramadol. On top of that, it's very unlikely that pasture lands where animals graze will have white snake root as an option on the menu. According to Science Direct, it's horses that are in the most danger these days, and eating white snake root is more severe for them. They eat it and usually die of heart failure. Nonetheless, if you had milk from one single cow that had munched on this deadly plant, then it is still possible you could get milk sickness. If you do get it, it's said there is no treatment. Death is likely, but you might just beat it.
When someone dies, they don't have to worry about money anymore. But there is a surprising amount of money involved with dying. Why is it so expensive to die? The costs start racking up before death. Sure, there are those people who die suddenly and without any other associated costs. For instance, someone who drops dead of a heart attack, suddenly without any other health problems, or someone who's just out for a jog and has a piano drop on their head. Someone's going to be shelling out a lot of money for that, but it's probably going to be the piano company. For many people, death is a much more drawn-out affair. For those who die of serious illnesses or at an old age, the odds are going to be there's a lot of medical expenses associated with dying. Dying can involve long-term hospital stays, time in an assisted living facility or nursing home, or specialized in-home hospice care. There are expensive services, and medical costs can be high in the United States and other countries without a universal healthcare system, as anyone who ever got a surprise bill after they got their finger stitched up can attest. While insurance will often pick up a large percentage of the medical bills, if not all of them, someone who is uninsured or underinsured when they die might leave behind a massive bill to be taken out of their estate. And that's before a whole lot of other costs. In 17 US states, the cost of dying averages over $20,000. In the UK, where high health bills are unlikely, it can still cost several £1,000s. While heirs of the deceased can't be held responsible for medical bills if the estate can't cover it, many other costs have to be paid for out of pocket by the family, which means that families dealing with the loss of a breadwinner may often have another challenge to deal with. So what are all these hidden costs? Well, the big one is something almost everyone who has said goodbye to a loved one will deal with: the funeral. The funeral industry has come a long way from when disposing of bodies was mostly a utilitarian industry, and today it's a $20 billion industry in the United States alone. Many funeral home providers offer full service from the moment of death to the conclusion of the burial ceremony, customizing services with mourners. And personalized services don't come cheap. Planning a funeral is a big feat, and often families are not up to managing it themselves, especially after a sudden and unexpected death. That means the funeral home and director will manage dozens of moving parts and help them select every part of what can be a very large event. For people with a lot of friends and family, a funeral can often resemble a wedding in what's needed. You'll need a large event facility, either indoors or outdoors, enough to hold everyone who wants to come. You'll want flowers and decorations, often personalized, and in many cases, families want catering for a memorial dinner. And that's before getting into one of the most important parts of the funeral. Gone are the days of a coffin essentially being a pine box. The coffin industry alone is worth over $500 million in the United States today, and shopping for one offers a lot of choice. Coffins are often made from fine wood and insulated with high-quality fabric. While this may seem like a waste given that it's going in the ground, many families want the coffin on display at the funeral and see a fine coffin as a testament to their love. An average coffin will cost at least $2,000, with high-end ones reaching 5 digits. And that's not the only preparation needed for a funeral. Funeral homes have someone on site trained in treating bodies and preserving them for funerals and burial. This is especially important for many people who want an open casket funeral. Have you ever been to a funeral where everyone is commenting that the deceased looks so natural and it looks just like they're sleeping? This isn't an accident. It's the work of a trained mortician who uses chemicals and makeup to keep the body from starting to decay too quickly and cover up any obvious injuries when possible. Not every funeral involves this. Some people choose a more natural burial, usually with a closed casket. But if you want the deceased to get the full makeover, it'll come with a cost. But that's not the biggest cost associated with funerals. 2 words: real estate. The most important choice people will make when planning a funeral is where they want the deceased to be buried. This isn't just a physical choice. The burial plot will likely also become a gathering spot for the family in years to come. But many cemeteries are facing a major challenge: lack of space. The population is growing and the cost of getting a burial plot is getting higher and higher. Smaller plots can be as little as $500 at a public cemetery, but can go for up to $5,000 for sought-after locations. For those who want a mausoleum burial, it can be as high as $10,000 at high-end places. And that's before you decide what to put on top of it. It's been a long tradition to have a marker memorializing a gravesite. Sure, no one's going to go as over the top as the ancient Egyptian pharaohs, although it might be tempting to build a pyramid for your beloved childhood dog Sparky, but gravestones can be pretty ornate. If you wander through a cemetery, odds are you'll see a few towering obelisks or carefully sculpted angel statues. If you want a highly decorative gravestone, the cost can vary wildly, but standard headstones with a personalized inscription will start at a cost of $1,000 or more. This can add up to a lot. Is there a cheaper way? For many families, if the deceased didn't leave behind a big estate, it's time to make some tough decisions. While holding a proper tribute for their loved one is ideal, there are ways to make it more affordable. Smaller funerals or graveside services are ideal to cut costs, and many families decide to have an online component where family and friends who can't attend in person can pay their respects virtually. Flat metal or marble markers in the ground can be a lower-cost alternative to headstones, while still paying proper tribute with an inscription. But there's one choice that many people make to cut costs. Sometimes, cremation. The burning of remains instead of burying them has become a massive industry in its own right, with many funeral homes also hosting a crematorium. We all know a friend or family member who has grandma's ashes sitting on the mantelpiece, and we probably give it a wide berth and stare warily every time the cat gets a little too close. And for those who want the simplest and lowest cost option, a basic cremation can be had for as little as $800. But that doesn't mean that many people don't find surprising costs. Cremation is a specialized service, with crematorium workers dealing with extremely hot and powerful ovens that can reduce a human body to bone ash in a short time. The cost of the equipment and training adds up, and so does the equipment it comes with. The standard urn that is at a constant risk of spilling ashes everywhere is mostly a thing of the past, with most urns sold by funeral homes coming in with specialized seals to prevent accidents. And there are many specialized and artisan urns available that can cost more than $500. But some families want a more permanent option. Some families choose the best of both worlds, cremation and a burial plot that gives them a place to visit and pay their respects. These plots are smaller and can be marked with a marker or headstone, but can still be expensive, at least $350 at a public cemetery and as much as $2,500 for a prime spot at a private cemetery. Because urns or cremation vessels can be held anywhere, it's also common to choose an above-ground spot in a mausoleum, which usually is more expensive. Well, at least the deceased doesn't have to worry about any of this, right? Not exactly. Because the funeral industry has become so big and expensive, many people are starting to think about these questions long before they're gone. It's like planning in advance for a vacation that no one wants to take. No one wants to put their loved ones into debt to pay for their funeral, so they're starting to take some common sense measures to make sure that expensive funeral costs don't throw the family for a loop. But those usually involve some costs of their own, paying for their own death in advance. The first step is to get life insurance. This will ensure your loved ones a payout if you die under most circumstances. This is especially important for breadwinners and single-income families, even if they don't expect to die anytime soon. Of course, the problem is that insurance companies don't want to pay out, so life insurance becomes more and more expensive as people get older. A 10-year policy on a 90-year-old probably isn't a good investment for the company. Whole life insurance is available, but it can be very expensive. But if you don't want the family to have to pay any death-related costs, that can be achieved too. Most of the time, people walking into a funeral home are the family of the deceased, but sometimes it's a healthy and happy person looking to arrange a funeral, their own. Most funeral homes will arrange end-of-life plans for people years or even decades before it takes place, down to the slightest detail. Want to rickroll the guests? They'll put that in a funeral plan and file it away. although it might not seem as funny when you're 85. And you can pay in advance too, over installments for many years. If you go before it's fully paid off, your loved ones will only have a fraction of the costs, but in many cases there'll be nothing left to pay. Of course, some people may make more unconventional arrangements to dodge costs. With cremation, many families choose not to keep the ashes forever. They'll take them home in a simple container without a formal ceremony or burial, and a while later, once the entire family and extended circle can get together, they meet at a meaningful location to scatter the ashes. While this might seem disturbing to some, after all, it's human remains being sprinkled in a public place, bone ash is biodegradable and considered harmless to the environment, so it's legal in all public places unless there are security issues. Private locations are dependent on permission of the owner, but that doesn't always stop people. A particularly popular spot is Disney's Haunted Mansion, as Disney-loving fans try to add a 1,000th to the famous assortment of 999 grim grinning ghosts. But that's not the only low-cost option for burial or cremation. Some enterprising companies have started offering unconventional ways to use cremation ashes, as they pose no health hazard and mix into things easily. Did Grandma always love to paint? Her ashes can be mixed in with paint and used to create a work of art. Did Uncle Billy like to live it up? A company specializing in fireworks can create a custom batch including a pinch of his ashes to send him off in style. There are even biodegradable urns that are meant to be buried and contain a tree seed along with the ashes to create a tree out of a loved one's remains, a living headstone far bigger than any obelisk. Many of these options aren't cheap, but they're usually a fraction of traditional funeral and burial with all the frills. And it's likely to just continue going up. People are living longer, and that means they're more likely to need healthcare before they die. Cemeteries aren't easy to maintain, and the demand for burial plots is growing as the population does. And with many funeral homes offering digital services like online memorial walls, it's becoming a more skilled and versatile position all the time. That adds up to one thing: a growing and complicated sector that will fetch a high cost for its services. There are only two things certain in life: death and taxes. But until scientists manage to cure the first, the high cost of death might be the third certainty. She's the longest reigning monarch in modern history and has ruled England as queen since 1952. But as Queen Elizabeth II passes her 96th birthday, many are wondering what exactly is going to happen when she dies. For those of us living outside of the UK, you might not be fully aware of who Queen Elizabeth II really is or what she actually does. If the UK is a democracy, then what does a monarch do? The answer is, well, not much. Queen Elizabeth II took the throne of the United Kingdom and the other Commonwealth realms on June 2, 1953, when she defeated the gargoyle armies of the sorceress Morgana by wielding Excalibur, which she pulled free from a stone. Admittedly, our historical knowledge of the British royalty is closely intermingled with King Arthur fiction, and Wikipedia tells us that there was actually no climactic battle for the throne of England. She simply assumed the throne after the death of her father. How boring. Ascending to the throne at age 25, Queen Elizabeth faced an empire in serious decline and a crown which faced ever-increasing irrelevancy. While the power of the British monarchs has been in flux over the last few centuries, it was in the 20th century that Britain decided to remove all power from the crown. The Parliament Act of 1911 stripped much of the power from the vaunted House of Lords and accelerated the decline of political power amongst the British royalty and nobility. By the time that Elizabeth took the throne, the title Queen of the United Kingdom and other Commonwealth realms was actually more of a formality than any kind of position of real authority. Though she did receive all of the castles and jewelry that came along with the title, today the Queen has several ceremonial duties and has no real political power to enact change or policy. She opens each session of Parliament and grants royal assent to new legislation, meaning that she formally approves the signing of new bills into laws, but the act is completely ceremonial and unnecessary for the functioning of the UK government, as no monarch has refused to give royal assent since Queen Anne refused to assent to the Scottish Militia Bill in 1707. Were that to happen again, and it absolutely wouldn't, then technically the entire government would have to re-sign and a new one would be drummed up, and it would bring the British political process to a complete halting crash and earn the deep ire of the people, and thus there's no chance of any monarch not assenting to a government bill. When you are out for lunch with friends and give your imaginary stamp of approval over a good meal, you're wielding about as much political power as any modern British monarch. Aside from these ceremonial duties, the British monarchy does do some good for England by acting as ambassadors for the country abroad. Despite thousands of years of oppression and a hard-won struggle for international democracy, many people are still enamored by the thought of lords and ladies who rule over them. Thus, the Queen and her family travel the world, spreading a diplomatic message crafted by the British government. As a titular figurehead, the Queen and royal family is technically the face of Britain. But what happens when she dies? Given her age, it's predicted the Queen will pass away after a short illness. During this time, she'll be surrounded by her closest family members and trusted doctors. News of the Queen's death will have to be carefully disseminated to the public, and some details may need filtering to keep the air of royal mystique intact. Once she is officially passed, an initial press bulletin will be prepared by the royal family, and immediately the task of safeguarding Britain from gargoyle attack will fall upon Prince Charles, who will become the new king. To show their allegiance, his siblings will then ceremoniously kiss his hands, vowing fealty to the new king of the United Kingdom. The Prime Minister will be alerted so that the actual British government can prepare to handle the news and any resulting fallout. Favor for keeping the royal family around and Britain technically a monarchy hovers at just over 50% in most opinion polls, and thus the Queen's death is bound to be distressing for a majority of people. The news to the Prime Minister will be relayed via pre-planned code in order to prevent the press, gargoyles, or any foreign agents from finding out beforehand. The news will then be immediately broadcast via secure communications channels to the 15 governments where the Queen is still technically head of state. This includes Canada, St. Kitts and Nevis, Antigua and Barbuda, St. Lucia, Grenada, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Jamaica, Bahamas, Belize, New Zealand, Tuvalu, Solomon Islands, Papua New Guinea, and Australia. In many of these places, the people deeply resent their colonial past, however, and thus the news might not be greeted with the somberness some people might hope for. A casual shrug might be the best the royals might hope for. At Buckingham Palace, a footman will be dressed in mourning clothes and proceed to pin a notice to the gates of the estate, and the website for the palace will be replaced with a single page, mourning the Queen's passing. However, most of Britain will learn about the news from the BBC's Radio Alert Transmission System, also known as RATS, or as some British people call it, Royal About to Snuff It. This system was designed during the Cold War and meant to survive even a full-out nuclear attack on the home isles. Radio stations around Britain will also receive an alert via a network of obit lights, a notification system meant to warn radio DJs of pending catastrophic national news. The alert signals that they should be prepared to switch to a national news broadcast soon and play inoffensive music in the meantime. Typically, this will be pre-generated playlists of mournful music. The British media will be wholly consumed by the event of the Queen's death, and on-air anchors will change to black dresses, suits, and ties. Radio stations across the country will play all the same news directly from the BBC. On TV screens, the royal standard will be shown with somber music playing over it on repeat for a few hours. Periods of silence lasting up to 5 hours might even fall upon the British broadcast media. The internet naturally will be relatively unaffected. Both houses of British Parliament will then be immediately recalled, and many people will be allowed to go home from work early as the nation enters a period of mourning. Then the process of bringing the new king up to speed will begin. Over the course of 9 days, which have already been scheduled and planned to the most minute detail, King Charles will undergo the necessary ritual proclamations and undertake a tour of the foreign nations that make up the United Kingdom: England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. Security will be tight, as there still exists plenty of anti-royal separatists in territories like Scotland and Northern Ireland, but any attack on the new king will be largely symbolic of a greater desire for independence from the UK. The passing of the Queen will have a substantial effect on the British psyche, as she represents a period known in modern British history as the Great Decline. Since even before her birth in 1926, Britain's former power as the greatest empire in the world was already in decline, but the process only accelerated during the dawning of World War II. For many British people, Queen Elizabeth remains the only link between the modern world and the former glory of the UK. And with her death, so too continues the decline in power that the nation has so far been unable to abate. While a completely symbolic position, the British crown is still a symbol of great significance to many, and a hope that one day England can become as great as it once was. Unless King Charles fails to defeat the gargoyle armies as his mother once did in her youth. It's time for round 2 of How Long Can You Survive? Where in the universe could you simultaneously die and live forever? How long would you last if infected with one of the most deadly diseases in the world? What would it be like surviving inside the stomach of a T-Rex? Let's find out. We're going to start by flying high. If you jumped out of an airplane without a parachute, how long would you survive? Most skydivers start their jump around 10,000 feet. That means if you free fell all the way to the ground, you'd last around 37 seconds before impact. At least for about 30 seconds, you would have a beautiful view. There are some skydivers who jump from higher altitudes. In those extreme circumstances, you'd survive slightly longer. If you jump from a plane at 14,000 feet, you would survive about 50 seconds of free falling before hitting the ground. And from 18,000 feet, you'd last 61 seconds. Depending on what altitude you left the plane at, you could calculate just how long you had before the Earth welcomed you back home. In the last video, we talked about how long you could last on the Sun, Mercury, and in the vastness of space. But what about the other planets? You may be surprised that there are places in the solar system that are even more hostile than the closest planet to the Sun. Let's start with the next planet, Venus. This world might have been Earth's twin a long time ago. If this were still the case, you could survive to the average old age of humans, which is around 70.6 years for men and 75 years for women. Unfortunately, Venus has a runaway greenhouse effect that literally makes it more hell-like than Earth. Venus is about the same size as our planet, so the gravity is pretty similar. However, its atmospheric pressure and temperature are vastly different. The second planet from the Sun has an average temperature of around 9,000 degrees Fahrenheit. In less than 1 second, you would be vaporized by those hostile conditions. Unlike Venus and Earth, Mars is cold and has a very thin atmosphere. On the red planet, you'd be able to survive a bit longer. In fact, if you had some extremely warm clothing or a spacesuit, you could survive on Mars indefinitely. That is, if you had enough food, water, and air to breathe. Although these seem like big obstacles to overcome, it's definitely better than being incinerated on Venus. If you're bundled up, you could survive around 2 minutes on Mars before you died from the lack of oxygen. Now things are going to get a little more intense because the next planet is the largest in the solar system. Jupiter has a lot of mass, and anything that has large amounts of mass has large amounts of gravity. There are a couple of problems with trying to survive on Jupiter, and any of the gas giants in our solar system for that matter, since they're made almost entirely of gas. If you try stepping on one of the planets, you'll fall right through toward its center. At some point you would hit solid ground, but you'd be dead long before that happened. You wouldn't descend very far before the pressure from all the gas around you would crush your body. On Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune, you would survive less than a second of falling through their gases before you were compressed into a marble-sized version of yourself. Technically, Pluto is not a planet, but it's still worth mentioning what would happen to you on this faraway hunk of space rock. The problem with a human surviving on Pluto is the lack of heat. The gravity on Pluto is around 1/5 that of Earth, so you'd most definitely not be crushed to death. If you could get a pickup game of basketball going, you'd be really good since you'd be able to jump about 25 feet off the ground. The problem with Pluto is that there is no air and no heat. The dwarf planet is so far away from the Sun that the average temperature is around -375 degrees Fahrenheit, so within seconds it would freeze you to death. If you were really resilient, you could probably last around 10 seconds, but it would be an unpleasant experience. This brings us to the most terrifying monster in the universe, black holes. How long would you last if you were to be sucked into a black hole? Since these mysterious objects seem to bend the laws of physics to their will, the answer to this question is quite surprising. If you were to fall into a black hole, you could be both pulled apart by gravity and frozen in time. How is this possible? I'm glad you asked. Let's imagine you were floating toward a black hole. Everything would be fine until you started closing in on the event horizon. This is where gravity is so intense that nothing, not even light, can escape. As you get closer to the singularity at the center of a black hole, the gravity becomes more and more intense. The problem is that this happens extremely quickly. There are massive changes in gravity every centimeter. For a few seconds, your feet are being pulled toward the center of the black hole quicker than the top of your body. Your body would begin to stretch. This might feel good for a split second. It would straighten your spine and stretch your muscles. However, as you approach the event horizon, the gravity is so intense it would literally stretch your body out into a thin noodle shape. This is aptly named spaghettification. So, from your perspective, you would survive until part of your body approached the event horizon of the black hole, and a few seconds later you would be dead as your body stretched into spaghetti. However, this is where things get really strange. As you approach the event horizon and gravity increases, time seems to slow down for someone who is observing you from outside the black hole. To that person, you would seem to be moving so slowly that it'd be hard for them to tell if you were moving at all. This all has to do with perspective and what one really smart man named Albert Einstein called relativity. Basically, the more gravity or faster you're moving, the slower time moves for you than someone who is observing you. Therefore, as you approach the intense gravity of the event horizon, you would seem to slow down, and once you hit the event horizon, you would seem to freeze completely. This means to an outside observer, you would be alive just before the event horizon practically forever, because it would take many of their lifetimes before your body would pass beyond that point and disappear into the singularity of the black hole. Eventually, you would just disappear from the observer's perspective, but it'd take a very, very long time. Let's head a little closer to home and see how you'd last in a shark attack. If we start with the best case scenario, you could survive for a while. A single shark could take quite a while to kill you, even if it was a great white. Shark experts recommend some key responses to help you survive the shark attack. Most are easier said than done, like don't panic and don't lose sight of the shark, and try to slowly back away. Sharks don't really enjoy the taste of humans, so if the shark lets go, you have a good chance of surviving. That being said, a shark bite can take a chunk of skin and muscle with worth it. The biggest threat after a shark attack is bleeding out. The good news is you'll have several minutes to seek help. However, if attacked by a large shark that takes a big bite, you have about 5 minutes until you bleed to death. This will vary based on the hole the shark created in your body, but you will have at least a few minutes to seek help. The worst case scenario is when there are multiple sharks and a feeding frenzy starts. In this scenario, hundreds of sharks could be biting you all at the same time, ripping your body apart. How long would you survive a shark feeding frenzy, you might ask? Your body would be torn apart in a matter of seconds, so you would barely have time to process what was happening before your vital organs were ripped from your body and swallowed by the sharks. Most of us never have to worry about one of the most deadly diseases in the world. However, this is not true for everyone. How long would you survive if infected by rabies? Keep in mind that this disease has a mortality rate of 99.9% in humans. First, let's put your mind at ease. Rabies is preventable if you are vaccinated against the virus. Even if you haven't been vaccinated, if you're attacked by an animal with rabies, you can get a shot which will allow your body to fight off the virus before it kills you. The problem is, if you don't get treated in time, you will die. The scariest thing about rabies is that once symptoms start to show, it's almost certainly fatal. The incubation period for the virus is between 2 to 3 months, so if you're infected with rabies, you will survive at least that long. However, once you start showing symptoms such as hyperactivity, cardiovascular complications, the development of phobias or paralysis, you have between 2 and 10 days before the disease kills you. After learning about how long you'd survive in all these situations, you might have decided it's a scary world out there. Perhaps you'd survive longer if you just stayed in bed, but you'd be surprised how not moving at all can take a significant toll on your body. How long could you survive if you never moved? Well, it'd be longer than if you were on another planet or went skydiving without a parachute. But not moving at all would eventually kill you. Let's imagine you have all the food, water, and other necessities you need to survive, but just never got out of bed. Eventually, you run into complications. After a couple weeks, your body would begin to become weaker due to lack of muscle and bone use. Within 6 months to a year, depending on the person, your body would begin to develop ulcers and bed sores. These would not kill you, but you'd be extremely uncomfortable. At this point, your mental health would begin to deteriorate as well, because we evolved to be nomadic, and laying in one place without moving is not what your body was designed to do. Even with all the vitamins and nutrients you needed to survive, your muscles would become so weak that circulating your blood would eventually become too much and your heart would fail. So, if you never moved, you could survive for about 2 years before your body gave up. What about if you were trapped in a car underwater? Not only is this a real fear, but unlike being sucked into a black hole, this could happen to you. If you careened off the road and ended up submerged underwater in your car, you could actually survive for a decent amount of time. Supposing that there was no damage to the windows or doors, the car would keep out most of the water. It may slowly begin to fill up, but something else would kill you long before the water did. Since you would be contained in your own little underwater world, you would have the oxygen that was currently in the car to breathe. However, with each breath, you would be poisoning your own air. You would be taking in the oxygen and replacing it with carbon dioxide. When the air in the car reaches about 15% carbon dioxide, you would die. So, how long would this take? If you could remain calm, which given the circumstances would be extremely difficult, you could last around 15 hours in a submerged car. However, you would probably start to feel fatigued and ill before that due to the high amounts of carbon dioxide that is poisoning your body. A more realistic number for length of survival in a completely submerged car with no leaks would be about 5 hours. The last survival scenario is something straight out of the Cretaceous. How long would you survive if you were swallowed whole by a T-Rex? Obviously, this could never happen because T-Rexes are extinct, unless some mad scientist decided to make Jurassic Park a real thing. Also, this would never happen because the T-Rex would tear you apart and eat you piece by piece rather than swallowing you whole. But just for fun, let's imagine you found yourself inside the pit of a T-Rex stomach. How long would you survive? We don't know exactly what the digestive system of a T-Rex was like, but we can make educated guesses based on animals alive today that share DNA with the king of the dinosaurs. Surprisingly, one such animal is the chicken. If you were swallowed whole by a T-Rex, you would have to avoid acid burns within their stomach. This might be done by pushing against the mucus-covered walls of the dino's stomach lining, but eventually you would get tired and end up in the dinosaur's digestive acid. It's likely your body would be digested and then pooped out a day or two later. So if swallowed whole by a T-Rex, you'd probably survive a few minutes before being digested alive by stomach acid. If you could make it all the way through the digestive tract in one piece, you'd come out the other end a couple of days after being swallowed.
Obesity, drugs, and alcohol abuse are routinely named as the fastest and surest ways to an early grave. Disease, accidents, drowning, and burning are also reasons our lives are cut short. But what is the one other major factor determining what age you will die at? One factor that trumps all of these? Well, have you ever felt so alone that you could die? Have you ever felt desperately in need of somebody to share your life? Well, if so, you're in the vast majority, as humans need, above and beyond everything else, other humans in order to have a happy and healthy life. In today's episode of the Infographic Show, we answer the very tragic question, can you die of loneliness? Recent studies claim that moderately drinking alcohol is not a death sentence, and that overeating, while dangerous, might not be the end of the world. But the largest factor relating to an early death was, according to these studies, in fact, loneliness. For the last 10 years, researchers have been looking deeply into the health implications of loneliness and social isolation, and the data is conclusive in that lonely people die earlier than non-lonely people, whether they smoke, drink, exercise, or not. Brigham Young University found that social isolation increases risk of death up to 30%, while other studies place the risk as high as 60%. Psychologically, loneliness is linked to depression, anxiety, substance abuse, schizophrenia, and dementia. It is safe to say that not all lonely people are depressed or suicidal, but it is also realistic to observe that of those who are suffering from psychological problems, that loneliness is a huge part of the problem. Loneliness can have practical and circumstantial effects that might lead to one's demise. A lonely person may have a disease that would ordinarily be recognized if he or she were amongst a group of caring people, or maybe a sudden health event like a heart attack or a stroke may go unchecked and nobody is there to rush the patient to a hospital. Is this death caused by loneliness or death caused by a symptom of loneliness? Well, that's a good question. Generally, good health and hygiene tend to be overlooked when one is living alone, advancing in age, and prone to forgetting to take their pills. Elderly people may simply slide in deathly decline without realizing it. Then factor in the chances of the house setting on fire and nobody being there to warn you, we survive better, statistically, when we have people around us. On a practical level, we have a better chance of surviving in groups, and that is why we are biologically predisposed to live as group animals. Although we do have a carnivore's solitary hunter instinct, we are still largely bovine and herbivorous in our social behavior. John Cacioppo, a social neuroscientist at the University of Chicago, once said, "For a social species, to be on the edge of the social perimeter is to be in a dangerous position. The brain goes into a self-preservation state that brings with it a lot of unwanted effects." So according to science, yes, loneliness is a very real threat, and it can kill you if you slip into a solitary world. The type of relationship we have is of equal importance to whether we have social relationships at all. It's not so much about how many people we socialize with, but the sense of connection we feel with those people. And relationships with the wrong types of people can also lead to an early death. We are statistically more likely to be murdered by somebody we know, and so-called enabling relationships, such as codependent, drug-dependent relationships, are worse for the individuals than had they not been together at all. Some people who have been subjected to abusive relationships in childhood are hardwired to seek solitude, as for them, that was the coping strategy that kept them safe. It is important that they break this way of thinking, as it will ultimately lead to them having a longer, healthier life. But what about those who simply prefer isolation? Those who are more comfortable and content being by themselves, who value solitude and feel awkward in social settings? Monks, holy men, sages, sadhus, all these figures throughout history have been known to acquire knowledge and wisdom through isolation, and why not? Having our social minds constantly set to on doesn't give a chance for us to rest and replenish, so there is an argument for temporary isolation. Solitude does help productivity and self-discovery, it also encourages deep thinking, and it helps people work through problems more effectively. This is why great scientists like Einstein, artists such as Van Gogh, and religious leaders such as Buddha spent a lot of time working out problems by themselves. Ultimately, although it depends on the individual, sociability and interaction with other humans is fundamental to living a longer, fuller life. And yes, loneliness can kill, you can die of it, and what's more, it is perhaps the world's biggest killer. So, do you enjoy being alone, or do you feel like loneliness is killing you? Let us know in the comments.
We all think about death on occasion. Sometimes this leads to us becoming hypochondriacs for a bit. Other times we think about what happens in the afterlife. If you lived in 17th century London, there were some truly frightening and bizarre ways you might have died. From records collected during the time period, we found some oddly named causes of death from the 1600s. Perhaps you would die of ague or jaw vein, or worst of all, the king's evil. We're going to look at some of the most unusual causes of death in the 17th century London and what they entail. The causes of death are going to be broken down into different categories, starting with basic pathogens and ending with the weirdest cause of death. By the time we get to the end, you'll be wondering how anyone survived the 17th century London at all. Epidemiology and other medical fields had a long way to go in the 1600s. This meant that curable diseases of today were much more likely to kill you at this time. Even still, the names given to some of the diseases are perplexing. If you were to die from ague, it means you would most likely have had a fever. Your muscles would ache and you would have some symptoms such as nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea. This was because ague was the name given to malaria. Now we have anti-malarial drugs that'll help someone recover from the pathogen. But in 1632 London, people were not so lucky. In 1632, 348 people died from bloody flux. What this identification refers to is bloody diarrhea and dysentery. The cause of death in today's medical terms was most likely from a disease like cholera. There were also a plethora of pox that killed people. Sometimes smallpox was identified as flox when death occurred. Other people died from what was labeled as French pox, which was syphilis. For really unlucky people, they might have died from the king's evil. This was an infection of the neck glands. Today, we know this bacterial infection as tuberculosis. Many parts of the world have eradicated the disease by using antibiotic regimens. However, in 17th century London, the only thing that was said to cure the disease was the touch of a king. Getting an antibiotic prescription from your doctor and sticking with it is a much more effective way of surviving the king's evil, just in case you were wondering. Another bacterial infection that was recorded was jaw fane. This cause of death could have also been called jaw fallen or lockjaw. Regardless of what the name was recorded as, they all were the same disease, tetanus. It's a bacterial infection that causes massive muscle spasms. These contractions often happen in the jaw and neck, which causes interference with breathing and can lead to death, hence the name jaw fane. Although viruses and bacteria caused many people to die in London during the 1600s, sometimes the body destroyed itself. A lot of this had to do with lifestyles of the day and a lack of understanding around healthy diets and cleanliness. If you died of apoplex, it meant that you were most likely paralyzed at the time of death. However, this was not what killed you. Instead, a rupture or clogging of blood, leading to an aneurysm or internal bleeding, would have been the cause of your death. If dropsy was recorded as your cause of death, it meant that, like with apoplex, your circulatory system let you down and caused massive swelling of a body part. This is what we call edema today, but it was identified as dropsy in 17th century London. This next cause of death is a little gross, so if you have a weak stomach, prepare yourself. According to records, 13 people died of fistula in 1632 London. Fistula was an anal abscess that became infected. This caused the anal cavity to fill with pus. The infection could be cleared out, but if left untreated, it could also lead to death. Fistula would have been an incredibly uncomfortable and messy way for those 13 people to have died. Another cause of death that comes from problems in the rectum would have been identified as piles. This identification referred to hemorrhoids, which are inflamed veins in the anus that are caused from strained bowel movements. This condition can also develop during pregnancy or from obesity. If the bleeding resulted from piles or fistula was left untreated, the person would die. One recorded cause of death that was not super specific was purples. This referred to someone dying due to widespread bruising. Purples would have been caused by blunt force trauma, a number of pathogens, or hemophilia, which affects the body's ability to clot blood. By identifying the cause of death as purples, all the doctor was saying that there were bruises on the body. 7 people in the year 1632 died from quinsy. This was an inflammation of the tonsils. Most likely it was what we know as tonsillitis today. However, a tonsillectomy would have been much harder with the lack of instruments and medical knowledge of the day. When left untreated, those 7 people died from tonsils obstructing their breathing pathway, causing them to suffocate to death. A final cause of death related to the failure of the body was called tympany. This referred to an abdominal growth, normally a tumor. It would lead to bloating of the abdomen due to trapped air or gas. The person would swell up like a balloon. While being checked for tympany, a doctor would thump the swollen part of the body, which would create a hollow sound not unlike a timpani drum. This brings us to the most bizarre identification and causes of death from 1632 London. Some of this stuff is almost too crazy to believe. It's hard growing up. All children take a nasty fall or hurt themselves at some point while growing up. It's a part of learning. But for the most part, in today's society, we look out for the younger generations of our species. However, in 17th century London, being a child seemed to come with some unique challenges and dangers. As discussed before, medicine and medical knowledge had a long way to go in 17th century London. That meant that many infants' cause of death were identified as childbed or chrysomes. Childbed was a death that occurred shortly after birth from complications in the delivery process. Chrysomes was the death of an unbaptized infant, or one that was less than a month old. These identifications in and of themselves do not provide a detailed explanation for the death, But since chrysomes was the highest cause of death recorded at the time, it was clearly dangerous to be a newborn in 1632 London. One of the crazier causes of death recorded during this time was overlaid. This referred to when a parent accidentally rolled over onto their baby while they were sleeping and smothered the infant. This was an incredibly sad and unfortunate cause of death, yet it was recorded several times during this time period in London. Also, the same category as overlaid was starved at nurse. This referred to the baby receiving insufficient amounts of breast milk or not gaining the weight required from the milk it was given to survive. Either way, it was a sad day when any infant or child's cause of death needed to be recorded. Other than disease and failure of a body system, there were also other causes of death that were quite peculiar. Kidney stones are incredibly painful. If they grow large enough, they need to be surgically removed. When the cause of death for someone was recorded as a cut of the stone, it referred to someone dying as a result of the surgery to remove bladder or kidney stones from the body. The distinction here is that the stones are not what killed the person, but the cut that the doctor made, or an unsuccessful surgery, is what led to the person's demise. Today, we refer to mental health as a serious aspect of life that needs to be addressed and treated with care. However, in 17th century London, very little was actually known about how the brain worked and different mental illnesses. 5 people in 1632 were identified as dying from lunatique. This was the term given to someone with mental health issues. There's no distinction between what mental state the person was in. However, there was a stigma against anyone who was suffering from an ailment of the mind. Not understanding what was happening in someone's mind led people to fear going insane. The main worries seemed to be that death as a lunatic would not allow for certain religions or deathbed rituals to occur before the person passed away. This brings us to the most peculiar causes of death in 17th century London. The names given to these causes of death and the causes themselves are baffling. In 1632, one person's cause of death was recorded as affrighted. This literally means that the person was scared to death. It's unclear what actually caused the person to become so frightened, but it must have been incredibly scary to literally have frightened them to death. Another really weird cause of death was listed as planet. This did not mean that they were somehow crushed by an entire planet. Instead, this cause of death referred to being planet-struck. It was believed at the time a severe illness or paralysis could have been caused by the influence of one of the celestial bodies in the sky. There is no scientific evidence that the motion of planets or stars has any effect on the aspects of someone's life, but in 17th century London, it would seem that some doctors believed that the cosmos could directly cause someone to become sick and die. We're not sure why the stars and planets would concern themselves with making someone sick on planet Earth, but apparently it happened in 1632 London 13 times. As a side note, this was not the first time a celestial body was associated with an ailment. It was believed that the moon and its cycles could cause people to literally go insane. This is where the word lunatic comes from. The prefix luna means moon, and lunatic refers to insanity created by the different phases of the moon. One cause of death that is still shrouded in mystery is rising of the lights. It most likely refers to an illness in the lungs. Perhaps the lights referred to the lightweight organs that were lungs, and the rising up referred to the movement of the chest during severe coughing. It's unclear what would distinguish rising of the lights from other respiratory illnesses other than it sounds nicer than death by lung infection. 86 people died from surfeit in 1632 London. This is a surprisingly high number for what surfeit actually is. Surfeit is death by overeating or gluttony. By eating too much, the person could have died due to dehydration from vomiting excessively. This cause of death may have referred to people who died from being overweight or diseases connected from obesity such as diabetes or heart failure. It's also been suggested that the surfeit could refer to someone who consumed too much alcohol, passed out, and then died by choking on their own vomit. Either way, surfeit would not have been a pleasant way to go. Many of the causes of death in 17th century London are still around today, but are not as prevalent as back then. The names of certain diseases and complications, however, have been changed over time with our understanding of how pathogens and the human body works. However, it's still puzzling that some of the causes of death even occurred. Just be thankful that you didn't live in 1632, where you could have died by planet, piles, or rising of the lights. You could say one of the more negative aspects of social media is it can be a fairly morbid affair at times. What we mean by this is if you have a large collection of virtual friends, it's likely over the years you're going to see a lot of RIPs posted on pages. You might not know these people well, but it can still be upsetting to see someone having fun in a photograph on Monday, writing down their thoughts on Tuesday, and then the next post on Wednesday is someone lamenting the loss of that person's life. They hang around too, even in death, showing up in your Facebook memories. The witty, kind, intelligent, and loving beings come back to you for a while, and not always at the right time. We might ask, do you ever really die online? Let's look at Facebook first. Does the social media platform know when you're dead? It might seem a little insensitive to some if a cold algorithm tells them to wish their friend a happy birthday and that friend died 3 days earlier after being hit by a cement truck. In 2019, it was reported by the New York Times that Facebook was trying to stop things like this happening. But if an account is just left, well, it's hard for Facebook to stop it being active. Action needs to be taken. The BBC has asked the same question. What happens with your online life when you die? And one article gives the example of a girl who was killed by her boyfriend. The girl's profile was never deleted, but neither were the photos of the girl with the killer. I wanted to remember Holly in her happy times without being able to see the face of her killer every time, the girl's friend told the BBC. Complaints were made, and after initially refusing to take the said victim/perpetrator photos down, Facebook did in the end get rid of all those images. So that's one thing. If you die and still have a profile on social media, then it seems your friends or family can ask Facebook to edit the profile. If some teenager's posts are him and his friends constantly partying, puking, smoke billowing from plastic bottles, can the family ask for those photos to be removed? It's not an easy answer, but it does seem there is a kind of loophole, meaning those photos belonged to you. You died, so now they belong to your estate holder. That might be your family. We must tell you though that getting photos removed seems difficult. As we've said, it has been done, but expect it to be a challenge. You can find many stories out there in which parents have tried to gain full access to their deceased child's Facebook page and have failed. What happens to a dead person's digital assets and who owns them is right now still a matter of controversy. There are some things you can do while you're alive though for a smooth digital death. Once Facebook has been informed that you are dead, someone will have to prove that to the company, and Facebook can freeze that page in time. This will require documents such as a death certificate. No one can log into the account any longer, but if you so choose while you're alive, you can tell Facebook who can manage your page in your infinite absence. These people are called legacy contacts. They can change your profile picture, write posts, add friends, but they cannot delete anything, request new friends, or read your private messages. If you want to just disappear from the platform once you give up the ghost, you can request your page is deleted. We guess we'll tell you that this is something you have to do now, before you die. Just Google how to do that. It's easy. It has to be easy because we're told that in 2018, around 8,000 Facebook users were dying each and every day. Well, that's a number given by one source in 2018. We also found the number of 312,500 a month, cited by another newspaper. Instagram is owned by Facebook. The policy is pretty similar. Families can have the account taken down or an account can stay frozen. The difference is that with Instagram, you can't choose a legacy contact, so someone will have to write to Instagram to ask for the account to be frozen. That's just Facebook. But for most people, their digital footprint has been trampling through various virtual spaces for years. Their mark is everywhere. Twitter is similar to Facebook in that you'll have to inform the company of the death, prove it's real with a death certificate, sign a statement to say you are real, and you can get the account taken down. Otherwise, it just stays. Twitter also states that images of the deceased can be removed, but only in special circumstances. Pinterest is the same. After a request, an account can be deactivated. In fact, that's the case for most social sites. When you die, a family member can have you removed virtually from the platform. The only difference is what proof you must hand over as to the death and who you are. Apparently, LinkedIn just wants to know how you're related to the person and then send them the obituary of that person. With Gmail, things are a little different. You might not know this, but Gmail already offers you options about what to do with your account after a specific amount of time of non-use. You can go to something called Inactive Account Manager, and that can be set so the account will be deleted after a certain time that the account hasn't been used. You can also take this a step further and add 10 trusted friends or family members who will receive a notification when this deactivation kicks in. With a death certificate, proof you are the owner of the deceased's estate, and information about yourself, you can also gain access to the dead person's account. As for our beloved YouTube, the Daily Dot wrote that the company has and will delete videos from inactive accounts. That doesn't mean that the person died, but the person no longer uses the account. The same story said there are plenty of videos still up there from deceased account holders, but it seems activity remains around those videos. But can anyone take control over the account? It's the same story again. You'll need to provide a death certificate, as well as all the information associated with the account. But if the account holder is over 18, you'll also again need to show you have power of attorney. If the account holder is younger than 18, the parents can gain access by showing YouTube the death and birth certificate. Quite a depressing couple if there ever was one. Microsoft seems to make the process a bit easier with their next of kin policy, which is very easy to follow. Let's say your son has had a Microsoft email for a decade. Similar to Gmail, with some effort you can get your hands on all the data in those emails. You'll need the death certificate again, a document proving you are the benefactor of the estate, a marriage certificate if you were married to the dead person, lots of personal information about yourself, and also information relating to the account of the deceased. If you pass this process, Microsoft won't give you access to that account, but will send all the data to you on a DVD. You'll get that DVD in just over a week usually. Microsoft says that if no one comes forward to request that information, then an account is almost always deleted after 1 year and 1 month. Any accounts with Apple tied to your Apple ID, the company states are non-transferable. They can be closed after your death, but someone will need to show a death certificate. It's virtually the same with Yahoo accounts, eBay, and PayPal. They need to be shown some proof someone died, but with PayPal, if you want to close the account, you'll need to be a legal executor. But that footprint of yours just goes on and on. You might bank online, but we won't go too much into cash as that's a different topic altogether. We can just say that finances of the deceased are an issue that will be dealt with by the next of kin. More importantly, what about your dating profile? Will people still be trying to hook up with your beautiful face after it's already started decomposing? Will so-called sapiosexuals be sending you lines of poetry well after you've uttered your last solemn syllable? According to the Match Group, who owns Tinder and a bunch of other dating sites and apps, the process is similar to most of the tech we have already discussed. The Match Group writes an account is non-transferable, and all of your rights to your profile or contents within your account terminate upon your death. It does seem, though, that unless someone contacts Match, your profile will be active there for a while to come. The way these things usually work anyway is that if there's no activity from you, you won't show up. The account, like the deceased, will become dormant. Match is vague, but it says when you die, your profile will just hide after some time. If you know you're going to die, of course you can leave passwords and instructions with someone, and they can be an executor and delete or manage your profile. But that might be the last thing on your mind. We might also add that you will likely live on in some way, as all your online activity won't just disappear from the internet. Many of you will know, because you've done it, that Googling your name will pull up some information about you. If you want to start the process of managing what will happen to your digital estate after you die, you can do that now. As we've shown, much of the tech you use will have options as to what happens to your data after you die. You can find information about this in those terms of service agreements you never read. If it's important to you, you might also make a will with a designated digital executor written into it. In that will, state what you want to happen to your data for each platform, website, etc. Make sure that executor will receive your death certificate, and you might also give them all your login information. You might not care because, well, you're dead. What does it matter? The simple answer is it might matter to some of your friends, family, loved ones. To be immortalized or not to be immortalized, that is the question. What do you think? Do you want to be out there online long after you pass away, or do you want to disappear? Imagine you're sick, lying in some nursing home bed hoping that you'll make a miraculous recovery. Then one day, a cat that's been adopted by the nursing home staff visits your bed. It curls up at your side, only for the nurses to give you a strange, sympathetic look. That's because whenever this cat chooses a certain person, that patient seems to die shortly after. This might sound unscientific and perhaps preposterous to you, but in 2007, an article published in the New England Journal of Medicine said just that a cat seemed to know when people were on their way out. We should say that the patients at the nursing home were already terminally ill, but not necessarily on death's door. Yet, when the cat visited a certain patient, they died just after. It confused the staff at the nursing home, to say the least. The cat's name was Oscar, and it was 2 years old when it started its routine of visiting people right before they left the planet. This nursing home in question was called Steer Housing Nursing Home, and it was located in Rhode Island, USA. It's reported that for a number of years, it sometimes craned its neck while curling up to the patient. Whenever that happened, the staff called the family in, knowing that this person didn't have long left. Over the years, the cat did this to 50 patients. So what's going on? Did the cat have a super sense? Could it literally smell death? A doctor wrote about this strange phenomenon in 2018, and he said he talked to the physicians at the nursing home, and they indeed told him the story had been corroborated by a number of medical staff. This was no charlatan kind of doctor, and he had actually won a Pulitzer Prize for a book called The Emperor of All Maladies, a biography of cancer. The person who first wrote the article about Oscar and his skills said, "No one dies on the 3rd floor unless Oscar pays a visit and stays a while." The story of Oscar and his sixth sense has elicited a lot of curiosity from doctors and the public alike. What people wanted to know was just how did he do it, because it seemed certain that this cat really did get it right time after time. The BBC asked this question, and after interviewing feline experts, the conclusion was not that the cat was psychic, but perhaps that felines can smell death, something that humans cannot smell. Maybe when we're about to die, the body emits certain chemicals and Oscar could pick up on that. In another article on the now famous cat, an animal expert told the BBC, "I don't doubt that the cat in this case is sensing death approaching. There's little we really know about it, but as the body is shutting down, I would hypothesize that the cat is sensing and smelling the organs shutting down." That same article said that there is some research that might suggest that dogs can sense when we are really sick with certain cancers, but that research is not conclusive just yet. There is some anecdotal evidence for this, but we can't yet call it science. There was a case when a woman's chihuahua reportedly detected her breast cancer, not just once, but on 3 occasions. There's also some proof that dogs can detect when someone's about to have an epileptic seizure, and this has led to some dogs being given to people as alert dogs. One woman said her alert dog licks her about 40 minutes before a major seizure so she can prepare for it. Perhaps dogs just sense this. They know when something's wrong, and perhaps Oscar, the cat, knew when something was very wrong. Some experts say that with dogs, they learned to sense sickness when they were wolves in packs and had to know when one part of the pack was ill. But with cats, it's more confusing, as they're not pack animals. It's only dogs, though, that sense sickness. A story published in the Scientific American explained that laboratory studies showed how mice could also sense when other mice were sick. There is additional anecdotal evidence that tells us some animals might know when something is seriously wrong with a person. Psychology Today published one such story in which a person's dog howled like crazy. When the owner was asked why the dog was howling like that, he said it's likely because someone somewhere is dying. Then it was discovered that the neighbor just died. After the death, the dog stopped its howling. You can find a whole host of articles out there that tell us dogs and cats can intuit when there's something wrong with us, whether it be an emotional problem, sickness, or when we're on our way out. A professor at Texas A&M University's College of Veterinary Medicine told the Chicago Tribune that this is mainly down to changes in our behavior, but she also said that dogs or cats might smell sickness or impending death. Okay, so with all this anecdotal proof that animals are able to do this, what can we actually do with their ability? Well, if animals might be able to predict death or detect a disease early, wouldn't it be great if humans could do the same? If a smell really is emitted, we should be able to smell that too in the best of worlds. If we can't smell death and we'll never smell death though, we have to come up with something else. If you've seen our episode on nursing homes and what's called palliative care, then you'll know that doctors will give some people a certain amount of time to live. This is no exact science, and doctors often get it wrong, usually being more optimistic rather than pessimistic. Wouldn't it be great if we could get it right? That has led some computer scientists to try to create an algorithm that's better at predicting death than humans. What one scientist was asked to do was create the death sweet spot. What that means is that people don't want to be going into care for more than a year, so if they have longer than that, the machine would say so. On the other hand, people generally don't want to die within 3 months because this gives them little time to prepare and for the family to prepare too. What if a machine could say for certain that a person had, say, 6 months left to live? If you could create an algorithm that estimated the time just right, it would save a lot of people a lot of trouble. Unfortunately, cats cannot do this, so the computer scientists started testing an algorithm. They used over 200,000 patients with diseases ranging from cancer to heart and kidney failure. They fed the medical information of deceased patients into their algorithm. If you could get enough information of what happened when, perhaps the algorithm could begin guessing how long a person had left. Certain symptoms and behaviors might show up for people at the same time, and so the machine could state that someone likely has 6 months left. Doctors, of course, could also have access to such information, and they have a lot of experience, but a machine can access a huge amount of data very quickly, which is something doctors cannot do. Doctors work with scores of people, but a machine could work with unlimited people from all over the world if the information was fed into it. So that's what researchers did. They fed all that information to what's called a deep neural network. It's an algorithm that's supposed to mimic how the human brain works. The machine had one task. It was to go through all that information and then make a decision. It was fed data from 160,000 patients, and then with the 40,000 patients left, it was supposed to give an estimate as to how long they had to live. It was pretty successful, too. It predicted in 9 out of 10 patients that they would die anytime within 3 to 12 months, and they did die within that time frame. It was 95% correct when it predicted the patient had longer than 12 months to live. Predicting death using artificial intelligence is a big thing, according to an article in Wired in 2019. But that article said that the machine might be biased because the doctors have been biased in the past. Doctors might treat races differently, and so that information will be fed into the algorithm, and if so, it'll be biased too. Doctors might also treat people differently according to their level of wealth. So this could be problematic if we are to trust the algorithm. The article concluded, artificial intelligence is a promising tool that has shown its utility for diagnostic purposes, but predicting death and possibly even determining death is a unique and challenging area that could be fraught with the same biases that affect analog physician-patient interactions. In the UK, a massive study was done using the health data of 500,000 people. It looked at how they lived and what health issues they had in their life, and then predicted early death, meaning dying before the average age of death in the UK. There was a lot of input from the participants in this study, from their waist size to where they worked, what kinds of foods they ate, how much alcohol they drank, and what their skin tone was. An assistant professor of epidemiology and data science at the University of Nottingham said the algorithm was pretty accurate, and over 16,000 people from the 500,000 did actually die prematurely over the years the study was conducted. The scientists used 3 types of algorithms, a simple one, a not-so-simple one, and an also very advanced deep learning algorithm. The latter guessed premature death 76% in the patients that died during the study, and the former guessed it right 64% of the time. The really simple one only 44% of the time. The lead researcher said this about the results. We've taken a major step forward in this field by developing a unique and holistic approach to predicting a person's risk of premature death by machine learning. This uses computers to build new risk prediction models that take into account a wide range of demographic, biometric, clinical, and lifestyle factors for each individual assessed, even their dietary composition of fruit, vegetables, and meat per day. It's still early days and a lot more research needs to be done, but one day soon a computer might tell you how long you've got based on a lot of variables. If you're already very sick, perhaps an algorithm will tell you at least how long you've got left, and so you can prepare for that. Cats and dogs with very sensitive senses are still a bit of a mystery to us, and so we're relying more on data than pets to tell us what chances we have of surviving. This is a controversial topic, of course, because what if the machine gets it wrong? What if someone's told they're going to die and so just gives up? We guess it's only a matter of time until we put our trust into these machines, but even if we do, perhaps we should never give up on a miraculous recovery. As for predicting when we'll die in general, it's complicated. You can go online now and input a bunch of data about yourself into a website and it'll tell you how long you'll live. But these things can't possibly get it right. We suggest you don't look at these sites. We did, and it seems that we're going much earlier than we expected. The Harvard longevity specialist David Sinclair appeared on the Joe Rogan Show again recently, and he pointed out that you can certainly embrace healthy habits to live a longer and more fulfilling life. But sometimes you're just unlucky in the lottery of life. You might have heard of the French woman Jeanne Calment, who lived until a ripe old age of 122 and a bit. She didn't seem to do anything special, and she only gave up smoking at 117. There's some skepticism concerning the exact age she died, but she didn't go pretty young, and that's a fact. She was cycling at 100, and while she didn't have the best heart, coughed a lot, and had rheumatism, she was in good shape throughout her winter years. With that in mind, we might just wonder how we might predict how old we'll be when we die. We don't want you now to start embracing bad habits, but just know that some people just seem to have the right genes. August 21st, 1986, a man named Joseph shakes himself out of a haze. His head is thumping, he's almost delirious. His nostrils are filled with the most noxious smell. He tries to say something, but words won't come out of his mouth. He surveys his body. It's stained red and covered in painful blisters. Before he can assess what's happened, he loses consciousness. He wakes up again and walks into his daughter's room. She's already departed from this world. With eyes filled with tears, he slowly walks over to his neighbor's house. All of them are dead. In every house in the village, he finds nothing but death. Riding on his his motorcycle outside of the village, he sees no sign of life. People he knew, even the animals in the fields, all of them are dead. This was one of the worst natural disasters to ever befall mankind, and the worrying thing is it could happen again. Now let's go back to the start. Early evening, close to Lake Nyos in northwestern Cameroon. Nothing is out of the ordinary. There are no signs of what's about to come. Like on any other evening, Joseph is out preparing dinner. His daughter is outside playing with her dog. The villagers are cooking their meals. Smokes from fires billows above their huts. Just after 9 p.m., some of them swear they can hear a strange rumbling sound. Many people are already asleep, their bellies full, unaware that they're having the last dreams they'll ever have. In just moments to come, they will all be dead, as will just about any other living thing. Not far away at the lake, the rumbling stops for a while, and then a whoosh, a massive jet of water some 300 feet high sprays into the air. This has never happened before, at least not for a long time. This serene lake, which the locals rely on for their drinking water, has a dark secret no one is aware of. When that jet of water rose into the air, it brought with it carbon dioxide that had been bubbling up in the lake for maybe 1,000 years. The gas formed a huge cloud as wide as a football field, and then it moved toward those villagers at a velocity that made it almost inescapable. When it arrived at the huts in those villages, it wrapped around those people like a cloak of death. There was nothing they could do. With only carbon dioxide to breathe, they passed out and died fairly quickly from suffocation. Some people survived, but not many. Joseph, who's very much a real person, was one of those survivors. He woke up at one point but then collapsed again. He recalled seeing red on his trousers, his body covered in what he called a starchy mess. Later, in an interview, he said, "I wanted to speak. My breath would not come out." He wasn't even in the worst hit village, which was one of the reasons why he survived. After seeing his daughter lifeless and then seeing how much of the village was dead, he got on his motorbike and headed over to the village of Wum. This is what he said about that perilous journey. "I didn't see any sign of a living thing. When I got to Wum, I was unable to walk, even to talk. My body was completely weak. When he arrived there, he was met with utter devastation. He could not even have imagined in his worst nightmare. Death everywhere. People were just lying in the road, collapsed over fences. Dead cows in the hundreds were lying in the fields. Chickens, pet dogs, all just lying on the ground, not breathing. Still, in a few of the huts, there were some people still breathing, but only just. Some of them would wake up in a day or two only to find every single member of their family had passed away. It seemed impossible. We guessed to a Western audience something straight out of an apocalyptic movie. Word soon got to the Western scientists. Nobody had heard of a catastrophic event of such magnitude. What just happened? Soon, newspaper headlines read things like aid and scientists flown into Cameroon. Teams of experts from North America and Europe booked their flights hoping they might solve this mystery of this mass death. Why would so many people just die and there not be any clear sign of what did it? It seemed at first to be what's called outgassing. This is when gas has been trapped and it suddenly gets released. But what happened at Lake Nyos isn't common at all. In fact, it was a strange thing indeed. The worst kind in recorded history. The scientists first had to understand just what had come out of the lake and what had made that water spray into the air with such violence. They lowered containers into the lake so they might just check what was in the water. They were shocked to find that when they pulled some of those containers to the top, the lids blew off. What was certain is that there was so much carbon dioxide in the water that it created enough pressure to cause the lids to blow. What had happened at the lake, they agreed, was a limnic eruption. This is when dissolved carbon dioxide is somehow displaced from the bottom of the lake, and as happened in this case, a large cloud of gas moves through the air, killing most living things on its path. Everything caught in this wake suffocates in such a case. The human death toll was almost 1,800, with over 3,500 livestock dying, all in an area of 16 miles of the lake. These events are incredibly rare, but it had happened before, again in Cameroon, at Lake Manaun in 1984. That time, 37 people died. But get this, there's a lake in Africa where a limnic eruption could occur and the lake is 1,700 times larger than Lake Nyos. It's also surrounded by about 2 million people. If an eruption happened, it could be one of the worst disasters known to man. We'll come back to that soon. First, we'll look more closely at what went down at Nyos. Scientists were sure that a limnic eruption had occurred, but they weren't sure what caused it. Some geologists put forward the idea that a massive landslide had caused it, but others said it must have been an earthquake. Still, if that was true, wouldn't someone have felt it? None of the survivors had felt the ground move beneath them prior to the gas attack. What seemed certain was that around 1.2 cubic kilometers of gas ended up forming that giant cloud. The water turned a red color at the time as a result of the bottom part containing a lot of iron mixing with the air and being oxidized. That's why Joseph saw red all over him. You might wonder why the cloud didn't just disperse into the air and harmlessly move right over the heads of the villagers. The reason is carbon dioxide is denser than air. That's why it moved low through the valleys and made its way to the villages. It moved fast, too, at around 12 to 31 miles per hour. Of course, it's not easy to get away from, but some people did. Most others suffocated and died without even knowing what was happening. The survivors survivors didn't get off easy. Many suffered from breathing problems after the disaster, while most of them had lesions all over their bodies. Some even became paralyzed but later recovered. Scientists wanted to know what had caused all those injuries. They figured CO2 was certainly the main culprit, but the release of sulfur dioxide and hydrogen sulfide could have also caused people's injuries. In Joseph's words, "My arms had some wounds. I didn't really know how I got those wounds." You can look at any medical website and it'll tell you exposure to hydrogen sulfide can cause headaches, nausea, convulsions, and certain eye and skin irritations. Joseph had also said he smelled something awful, and that could have been the rotten egg malodor of hydrogen sulfide. The villages were evacuated for the time being while the researchers stayed. In fact, they had some disturbing news to report back to the Cameroonian government. That carbon dioxide was growing in the lake at a disturbing rate. If something wasn't done about it, a similar disaster could happen again. One survivor was named Sully. She lost all of her children and another 31 members of her family. She lost over 400 cattle, too. In the aftermath of the disaster, she and the other survivors even remarked that there weren't any flies on all the dead bodies. The flies themselves had died. Those survivors banded together and helped each other best they could, but they were still afraid of the lake. They hadn't in the past had much interest in science, but instead myths surrounded the lake. Some of those stories stated it was home to their dead ancestors and that it might rise up one day and cause calamity. Tales of how dangerous the lake was had been passed on through generations. They were right, but perhaps ignorant of exactly what caused the danger. Scientists talked about such a geomythology, saying no doubt catastrophes have happened over many years and stories have been passed down, but what they wanted to do was make sure there were no more catastrophes. They got to work not knowing if something would go off again and they'd be the ones lapsing into a coma and dying. The villagers that survived invited them into their homes and made sure they always got a good meal. You have to remember this place was extremely remote. The only hotel was a hut. Over the weeks and months, they figured that the lake made from a crater sat on top of volcanic rubble. They knew carbon dioxide was down there and that springs could take that into the water. They didn't know what had caused the massive eruption, but they knew where that gas had come from. It was a time bomb and it was sure to go off again one day. They considered digging tunnels down there to try to free the gas, but that would cost way too much. They even tinkered with the idea of using explosives to free the gas, but that was deemed a bit too dangerous even if the immediate area was evacuated. In the end, they decided to lay down a pipe at the bottom of the lake and let the gas run through that. Small amounts could slowly be released through the pipe and then come out the top of the pipe into the air. Some experts thought that would be too dangerous, but by the time 2001 rolled around, a pipe had been laid and the degassing of the lake began. Right now, the lower parts of the area around Nilos are still eerily quiet. Many people have moved to safer places, but the disaster is never far away from their thoughts. Some others missed the place where they lived for so long and are now living aside the Great Lake again. The good news is that the experts say there are just 3 lakes in the entire world where so much carbon dioxide can cause such a disaster. Those are Lake Nyos, Lake Monaun, and, like we mentioned, Lake Kivu, which sits on the border of the Congo and Rwanda. The problem with Kivu is it's a giant, as we said, 1,700 times bigger than Nyos, and surrounded not just by small villages but millions of people. Just remember that scientists don't exactly know what caused the Nyos eruption, so it seems such a thing could happen without any warning signs. If Kivu erupts, it could be a disaster like no other the world has ever seen. Scientists went there after the Nyos disaster, and what they found was a supersaturation of gas, meaning it was a disaster waiting to happen. Sure, such events are supposed to take place maybe every 1,000 years, but no one knows when the last one happened. What they do know is very large extinction events have occurred around the lake. They say if it should happen again, and given a long enough time frame it should, then a lot of those 2 million people could die. Experts also warned that lake tsunamis could also occur due to those explosions of gas. Pipes could be built to allow the gas to release in a safe manner. There are around 510 million metric tons of carbon dioxide down there. That's about 2% of what's released into the atmosphere each year from humans burning fossil fuels. Right now, there are no pipes at Kivu. The locals might not have experienced such a catastrophic event in the area, but they've heard of the word mazuku. This is Swahili, and in English it means evil wind, a wind that blows over people and animals and even plants, and when it's passed, all in its wake are dead.
"I'm having so much fun I could die" is an expression that you've no doubt heard more than once. But is it scientifically possible to experience so much pleasure that our bodies stop functioning, give up, and keel over? We often speak about how much pain a human can handle, but is there a pleasure threshold? And more importantly, are we as human beings hardwired to simply pursue pleasure no matter what the risk? Why do we travel thousands of miles to jump off mountains, swim deep under the ocean, or be chased by an angry bull? Historically, pleasure seekers have trodden unfamiliar paths leading at times to enlightenment or education, and other times to electrocution or even extermination. Today we'll find out why. In this episode of the Infographic Show, can you die from too much pleasure? Scientifically, pleasure is the release of dopamine. This chemical neurotransmitter is our little messenger between brain cells. It plays a part in how we move, what we eat and drink, and how we learn and generally function as human beings. Dopamine's purpose is to motivate us to keep doing what we enjoy doing. It is simply the brain's reward system, and while dopamine is responsible for many positive pursuits such as eating, drinking, exercise, and maintaining healthy relationships, it also has a darker side. Dopamine can be that little devil on your left shoulder whispering less than wholesome demands. These messages can trigger antisocial behavior, such as drug addiction. Some of the weirdest and most wonderful behavior that we can experience, while pleasurable, can also lead to us cashing in our chips earlier than naturally expected, and here we find out why. Pleasure is an emotion, and while emotions don't usually kill, they can land us in some dangerous situations. Let's take an example of a young trainee fighter pilot flying in formation. He's thousands of feet up in the blue yonder, with 5 or 6 other fighter planes to the left, right, in front, and behind him. This is a mean feat by itself. Not only is he putting his own life at risk, but the lives of the other pilots too. Suddenly, the young pilot remembers an old joke. This hilarious episode inexplicably pops into his head, a wide smile crosses his mouth, and he breaks out into uncontrollable, unstoppable laughter. His motor skills have been compromised. The aircraft begins to sway side to side a little. We've all had this happen before, but normally in safer surroundings, such as sitting on the bus. The pilot is in a much more dangerous setting and is suffering from a galactic seizure. His body is exhibiting all the signs of physical pleasure and happiness, and he is subsequently putting not only his own life at risk, but the lives of others too. If he doesn't regain control of his emotions, soon the whole flight team will be at risk. As this example illustrates, emotions such as happiness or joy don't kill us, but the physical manifestations of these emotions can. Medical research has shown that an overstimulation of the sympathetic nervous system may result in an abnormal heart rhythm or even sudden death from heart failure. Overwhelming grief from a death in the family or the shock of getting fired can actually kill you. This is known as broken heart or Takotsubo syndrome. A sudden weakening of the muscular portion of the heart triggered by emotional stress can actually cause our left ventricle to change shape to resemble the shape of a fishing pot. Takotsubo means octopus trap in Japanese. Studies have shown that although 96% of sufferers of this condition were experiencing negative emotions, some 4% of Takotsubo sufferers were the recipient of recent good news or experiencing a happy occasion, such as attending a wedding leading up to their diagnosis. A study in 2011 collected 1,750 cases from 25 hospitals, and they found emotional jolts were responsible for 485 Takotsubo events, but some 20 of those cases had experienced a happy occasion prior to their heart attack. This has led researchers to wonder if Takotsubo is not only a broken heart syndrome, but also a happy heart syndrome. Perhaps one can die of happiness in this way, but the chances are statistically slim. Generally, people who die from pleasure are risk seekers by nature, and their hazardous behavior in pursuit of pleasure is what kills them rather than the emotion itself. The French refer to the orgasm as le petit mort, or the little death. But sometimes the little death can lead to the big sleep. In Thailand, in 2009, Kung Fu and Kill Bill star David Carradine was found dead in a hotel room closet with a cord tied around his neck and his private parts. Thai police, with Sherlock-like skill, immediately suspected his death to be the result of a dangerous solo sex practice. And he is not alone. Between 500 to 1,000 Americans die each year as a result of cutting off the oxygen to their brain while engaging in acts of solo gratification. Libertine pleasure seekers don't just stop at autoerotic asphyxiation. Investigations have led to the discovery of pleasure seekers found dead after episodes with vacuum cleaners, frozen sausages, vegetables, and farm vehicles. In 1987, Australian Liberal Party leader Sir Billy Sneeden was found dead of a heart attack in a hotel room wearing nothing but a latex condom. It was later discovered that he had been entertaining his son's ex-girlfriend earlier that night. His son, Drew Mackey Forsyth Sneeden, later commented, he'd had a number of lady friends around Australia and abroad, he got around a lot, and what could be more liberal than that? Then we have those who engage in pleasure-seeking pursuits such as base jumping, free solo climbing, bull running, hang gliding, scuba diving, and heli skiing. Since the first climbers of Everest, there had been 219 deaths up until 2011. The United States Parachute Association estimated about 2.6 million jumps were made each year between 2000 and 2010, and over that period, 279 deaths have occurred. Since the activity became popular, 180 base jumping deaths have occurred, and this death rate has accelerated since the introduction of flying squirrel wingsuits. And you're not that much safer at sea, with 197 of diving fatalities recorded by the BSAC from 1998 to 2009. And then there are those dark tourists who travel to war or disaster zones for adrenaline kicks. And last of all, let us not forget the death by selfie phenomena. In the first 8 months of 2016, 73 pleasure seekers died while taking selfies. That's more than the number of people killed by sharks in the same time period. So, can you die from too much pleasure? It is very unlikely. The real question is, can you die from pursuing too much pleasure? And the answer to that question is a resounding yes. Pleasure seekers die in all sorts of ways, so watch out next time you take a selfie.
Death. One of life's greatest mysteries. While we tend to think of death as a single moment of finality, the reality is much more complicated than that. Death is a process, and even when death happens suddenly, it can take anywhere from several days up to 2 full weeks for all parts of your body to completely shut down. You won't believe some of the crazy things your body does after you die. You may be dead and gone, but parts of your body go on living after you die. Your internal organs will remain alive and viable for hours after your death, which means that they can be transplanted into someone else who desperately needs them if they're removed within 30 minutes and transplanted within about 6 hours. Your skin can live on for even longer. Skin grafts can be done up to half a day after you die. Organ donation is certainly one way to ensure that part of you lives on even after you're gone. Your skin can do some other wild things too. It can change color as your blood pools in certain areas of your body while it lies there waiting to be discovered. If you died of carbon monoxide poisoning, your blood and even your internal organs would turn a bright shade of cherry red, and so would your skin wherever the blood pools. If, on the other hand, hydrogen sulfide was the culprit in your untimely death, your skin would turn a lovely shade of green. It's not all bad news. After death, as your muscles lose tension, your skin will smooth out and your wrinkles will disappear, so that's something, we guess. If your organs and your skin can live on after death, what about your brain? History is full of hideous stories of the severed heads and beheaded prisoners living on, staring around at the assembled crowd of onlookers and even making gruesome faces. Can your head really live on after it's been separated from your body? Actually, yes, for a few seconds at least. Just as a severed limb can continue to twitch due to muscle reflexes after it's separated from your body, subconscious reflexes can carry on in the brain's extrapyramidal system. This is the area of the brain that's responsible for infants unconsciously showing facial expressions of fear or disgust, and it can live on after your head is separated from your body, causing your severed head to make some rather gruesome faces and make it appear like your head is still alive, for a few seconds anyway. A sudden severing of the brainstem would lead to a massive drop in blood pressure, blood loss, and lack of oxygen, and your brain would quickly follow your body into death. Is it just your reflexes that survive after death, or can your consciousness persist too? People whose hearts have stopped and who have seen the light, so to speak, can later describe exactly what happened to them after they've been resuscitated, and recent studies on animals have shown a surge of brain activity immediately after death, leading scientists to conclude that some form of consciousness remains intact after you die, at least during the first stage of death. That means your brain can actually know that you're dead for a few moments before it dies too. This doesn't last long though. Once your heart stops beating and your brain is no longer getting any oxygen, your brain cells will start to die, and your brain will be dead within 3 to 7 minutes. If your organs, skin, and brain can live on after you've kicked the bucket, then does that mean that there's truth to the myth that your hair and nails keep growing after death? The truth is, your hair and nails do get longer after you die, but not for the reasons you might think. Your nails and hair don't actually keep growing after you die, but as moisture leaves your skin and it dries out and recedes, it can make your hair and nails appear longer. The skin on your face and chin will recede and dry out, pulling back tightly toward your skull and making any stubble on your cheeks appear more prominent, which is why many men appear to grow a beard after death. What happens to your eyes after you die? If you die with your eyes wide open, then the whites of them will dry out and turn gray or blue. This is a process called tache noire, which is French for black line, because that's exactly what it looks like, a dark line of discoloration across the middle of your eyeball. Here's a fun fact. Tache noire is often used as a trick question on the final tests for medical examiner certification, since it's common for inexperienced examiners to mistake the discoloration for a hemorrhage or a sign of disease. Even after you're dead and gone, it might take some time for your body to get the message. After your brain shuts down, it can take a few minutes for the nervous system to catch up, and it's not uncommon for a dead body to appear to move shortly after death. This is thanks to the residual reflexes and nerve spasms, which can cause your muscles to twitch and jerk until rigor mortis sets in. In rigor mortis, your muscles become shorter and tighter, and your body stiffens and becomes rigid thanks to a buildup of lactic acid and calcium. Rigor mortis can start to set in within 3 to 4 hours of death, and by 12 hours after death, even your largest muscles will have become stiff and rigid. Rigor mortis can last 3 days before your body starts to relax once again, and it can last even longer if your remains are kept refrigerated. If our organs can continue to live on, our nervous system can keep firing, and even our consciousness can remain intact after death, then we can't help but wonder, do our bodily functions carry on after death? As it turns out, they do. Many dead people will appear to have wet themselves. Is this because they were so terrified at the moment of their death that they peed themselves? No. It's actually a completely normal bodily reaction to death. As your muscles relax, your body can let go of the things it's been holding in. All of the things. Shortly after death, your bladder will relax and empty. Your colon will relax and empty itself too, but this can take up to a few hours after death. Lovely. It's also extremely common for a dead body to pass gas. A buildup of excess bacteria after death creates a lot of gas inside your body, and as your muscles relax into death, your body will release those gases as burps and farts. How rude! It's also not unusual for a dead body to moan, groan, and squeak after death as the air trapped inside of the body escapes, especially as the body is being moved or manipulated. Speaking of bacteria, although you might be dead, the trillions of bacteria that make their home in your gut are alive and well. Thanks to those bacteria, the digestion process can carry on long after you die. And once those hungry bacteria are done feeding on any leftover food in your digestive system at the time of your death, they will eventually turn to a new source of food. You. Your own gut bacteria will turn on you and will start to digest your body from the inside out. And as they do, the amino acids in your body will break down and begin to emit some very foul-smelling compounds, called, appropriately, putrescine and cadaverine. You can thank this process for that unmistakable putrid smell of death. Believe it or not, your digestive system isn't the only system that can remain online after death. It's not unheard of for a dead body to show certain signs of life, if you know what we mean. As the flow of your blood slows down, blood begins to pool in certain areas throughout your body. Depending on the position of your body, it can pool in some rather unusual places. If, for example, you died in a face-down position, blood could pool in your genital region and make it appear as though you have an erection in death. Rigor mortis can also make things a little stiffer down there. If that's not weird enough, it's also common to find fluids near the erect member, although this is actually seepage from your prostate, not true ejaculate. For some strange reason, researchers have investigated whether dead people can have orgasms, and their findings might surprise you. It turns out that the so-called beating heart dead people who are being kept alive on a ventilator, actually can have orgasms. By electrically stimulating the sacral nerve, researchers have found out that they can cause orgasms in 91% of beating heart dead females. We're not sure that'll do you much good when you're dead, but we guess it's good to know. After your body is really and truly dead, your organs have shut down, your brain and nervous system are offline, your muscles have relaxed, then stiffened, and then relaxed again. What happens to your corpse next? First, your body will rapidly get cold, dropping 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit per hour until it reaches ambient room temperature. Once your body has been buried, it could be mostly gone within just a matter of months. At 50 degrees Fahrenheit, it'll take about 4 months for your body to fully decompose. All that'll be left of you is your skeleton, some cartilage, and some bits of dried skin inside the tattered remains of your best funeral suit. What if you aren't lucky enough to be properly preserved and buried? If your dead body were left in a cool, damp environment, you could actually turn into a blob of human soap. Through a chemical process called adipocere, your body's fat will be turned into a waxy, soap-like substance, preserving you in a pale yellow or gray blob appropriately called grave wax. If decomposing or worse, turning into soap doesn't sound like your thing, never fear, there are plenty of other crazy things you can do with your body after death. Sure, you could donate it to scientific research or to a cadaver farm where forensic students can practice finding and analyzing your decomposing corpse, but you can also take things a step further. If you're the more environmentally conscious type, your remains could be scattered among a tropical reef to sustain marine life in death. Or you could choose to be buried in a special pod that will grow into a tree. There's also cremation, which opens the door to all kinds of other crazy options. Your ashes could be made into a memento like a piece of jewelry, a glass sculpture, or a granite-like statue. If that seems too ordinary for you, you can now have your remains turned into a record containing your favorite songs. or even blended into paint or tattoo ink. If you want to go out with a bang, your ashes could be made into fireworks or shotgun shells. As it turns out, death is not quite as simple or as neat as we might like to think. From post-mortem erections to dead bodies passing gas, there are plenty of wild and crazy things that your body does after you die. Death. One of life's great mysteries. Despite huge advances in science and medicine, we're no better at predicting the exact date and time of our own death than a carnival fortune teller would be. While we may not be able to predict when any one individual person will die, we have certainly come a long way in understanding the life expectancy for entire populations, and everyone from insurance companies to medical researchers rely on this information to make important decisions every day. Understanding life expectancy around the world, throughout history, and even into the future can help us all make better decisions about our daily lives too. So, when will you die? Find out, if you dare. We're certainly lucky to live in a time when global life expectancy is at an all-time high. The average person alive on Earth today can expect to live up to the ripe old age of 73. Women have it a bit better with an average life expectancy of 75.5 years, while men can expect to live just under 71 years. But that's global life expectancy. If we take a closer look at different countries individually, we can see that life expectancy varies quite a bit around the world, even today. The region with the best life expectancy today is Hong Kong, where the average woman can expect to live for a whopping 88 years, and men have a life expectancy of 82 years for an average of 85 years for both sexes. Most developed countries have an average life expectancy of over 75 years. Australians live an average of nearly 84 years, Canadians can expect to stick around for almost 83 years on average, and Americans have a life expectancy of about 79 years. Less developed countries unfortunately have a much lower life expectancy. In the Central African Republic, the region with the lowest life expectancy in the world, the average life expectancy is just 54 years. Somalians can expect to live 58 years on average, and people living in Haiti have an expectancy of 65 years. When we're talking about how long someone will live, it's important that we understand the difference between life expectancy and lifespan. The figures we just went over are averages for life expectancy. Life expectancy is the average number of years of life for an entire population, taking into account how long each individual person actually lived. Lifespan, on the other hand, is the actual length of any given individual's life. For example, while the average life expectancy in the year 1200 AD might have only been 35 years, does that mean that most people back then only lived to be 35? Of course not. Life expectancy is calculated from birth, and that figure includes rates of infant mortality and childhood deaths. In ancient times, before the advent of modern medicine, the likelihood of dying during birth or in early childhood was much higher, and these early deaths dragged down the average life expectancy for the whole population. For every child who's died as a baby, another person could have lived to see their 70th birthday. But when all these individual lifespans are taken together, the average life expectancy lands somewhere in the middle, around 30 to 40 years. Hong Kong, which currently boasts the highest life expectancy in the world, also has some of the lowest infant and child mortality rates, with just 1.2 infant deaths per 1,000 live births, and only 1.9 deaths per 1,000 children under 5. In the US, these numbers are a bit higher at 5.5 infant deaths per 1,000 and 5.7 deaths per 1,000 in children under 5. But even these numbers are nothing compared to the Central African Republic, which has 71 infant deaths per 1,000 live births and 106 deaths out of every 1,000 children under 5. When we factor in infant and child mortality, it's easy to see why the Central African Republic has the world's lowest life expectancy. Factors like access to medical care, disease, war, famine, and natural disasters all contribute to lower infant, child, and adult life expectancies. We may be currently living in an age of all-time highs for life expectancy, but it definitely wasn't always this way. In 1950, just 70 years ago, the global life expectancy was just 47 years, and in the US it was only slightly better at 68 years. If we go back a little further, the average life expectancy in Europe in 1800 was between 30 and 40 years. The same factors that account for the vast differences in life expectancy between countries today is to blame for the low life expectancy in the past. Access to medical care, war, famine, disease, and high infant and child mortality. Infant mortality rates are also improving around the world. In 1921, even countries like Canada had a 10% infant mortality rate. So as these numbers improve, the average life expectancy increases, especially in developed nations. So now that we understand the difference between life expectancy and lifespan, and have learned a bit about life expectancy around the world and throughout history, let's take a look at the really important question: when will you die? In other words, what is your personal expected lifespan? There are a few major factors at play when calculating your personal life expectancy. Obviously, the country you're born in plays a huge role, as we've already seen. Gender is another big one. You might have noticed earlier that the life expectancy data always seem to favor women. In the US, women can expect to live to 81, while men have a life expectancy of just 76 years. Some researchers chalk this up to the fact that men are more likely to engage in riskier behaviors than women, making them more likely to die an accidental death. Genetics is another big factor in your life expectancy. 9 of the 10 leading causes of death in the US currently are directly linked to genetics. If you have a family history of heart disease, cancer, diabetes, Alzheimer's, or other hereditary diseases, your life expectancy might be lower than average. Thankfully, advances in medical care have boosted life expectancy in recent decades, thanks to innovations like antibiotics, immunizations, surgery, and medical imaging. Medical conditions that would have been life-threatening just a few generations ago are now largely treatable thanks to advances in modern medicine. Things like your country of birth, your gender, and your genetics are largely up to fate. But what about factors that are within your control? Is there anything you can do to impact your life expectancy? Thankfully, the science says yes. Education level has a shocking impact on life expectancy. While not everyone is lucky enough to be able to go to college, if you can manage it, it might actually help you live longer. American men with only a high school education live an average of 9.3 years less than those with a bachelor's degree or higher. For women, a bachelor's degree increases their life expectancy by 8.6 years. Better get studying. This one might surprise you, but married people actually live longer than single, divorced, or widowed people. This may be due to the fact that married people are less lonely and isolated, and having a partner might motivate you to take better care of yourself by living a healthy lifestyle and seeking medical care. Who knew a nagging spouse was good for your health? Of course, there are plenty of everyday lifestyle decisions that we make that can have a huge impact on our lifespan. Eating a healthy diet, exercising regularly, avoiding smoking, and limiting drinking are all great ways to improve your health and increase your lifespan. Avoiding risky behaviors and ensuring a safe work environment and safe driving habits can also help. Data shows that socioeconomic status also plays a role here. Those with higher incomes are more likely to exercise and eat well and less likely to engage in risky behaviors like smoking and drinking. So now that we know what factors impact your life expectancy, is it possible to find out when you will die? There are plenty of lifespan calculators available on the internet that purport to calculate your date of death, like faithfulday.eu and deathclock.org. Let's look at a few examples from these calculators to see when you might die given your current age and some lifestyle factors. According to deathclock.org's calculator, a 15-year-old male born in the US who is of average height and weight, doesn't smoke or drink, and is not depressed can expect to live to the ripe old age of 80. The calculator actually takes it a step further and estimates their date of death to be Sunday, August 5th, 2085. A female with similar factors would live until age 85 or until 2090. However, a 25-year-old male who is an overweight smoker and a heavy drinker would only expect to live to age 61. Their date of death is calculated to be Thursday, August 3rd, 2056. A similar 25-year-old female would expect to die in 2056 at age 66. It's certainly spooky to have a calculator tell you the date of your impending death, but it's important to know that these tools are calculating average life expectancy for someone with your factors, but they can't really predict with any accuracy your actual date of death. If you really want to know exactly how long you'll live, it turns out that your DNA just might hold the answer. Scientists like Steve Horvath, a biostatistician at UCLA, are turning to DNA to see if the date of our death is written into our genetic code. Their findings are truly startling. Horvath has discovered an epigenetic clock in our DNA that's remarkably accurate at predicting when we'll die. His tool, called DNA M-Grime Age, can calculate whether an individual is aging at a faster or slower rate than average. If the tool shows that you're aging 8 or more years faster than your biological age, you have 2 times the risk of dying than the average person your age. If you're aging 7 years slower than average, your risk of death is cut in half. So when will you die? Thanks to science, you just might know the answer to that before you know it. If life expectancy has been on the rise, especially in the last century, does that mean that we can soon expect to live to the age of 100 and beyond? Well, not exactly. Some experts are actually concerned that the recent rise in obesity rates in developed countries will actually halt the trend of increasing life expectancy within the first half of the century. 5% of the US population is obese today, compared to just 1% in 1962. If this trend keeps up, we'll likely see a slowing of the trend of increased life expectancy, and we may even see a reversal, with life expectancy declining around the world. While this is certainly not great news, thankfully this is largely related to factors that we can control, such as diet and exercise. If more people begin to live a healthy lifestyle, we might just be able to correct this problem. It might not be possible to accurately predict exactly when you'll die, but science is definitely getting closer. We live in an age with the highest life expectancy in history, thanks to advances in medical care and lower rates of infant and child mortality. The average person today can expect to live almost twice as long as their great-grandparents did. And that's the good news, and it may be tempting to assume that we're on track to live forever. Unfortunately, the bad news is that this trend of increasing life expectancy might actually be in danger of reversing in the near future if we don't reduce rates of obesity and live healthier lifestyles. If humans truly want to be immortal, or at least live longer lives than their parents did, we have some work to do.
You're probably thinking after seeing the title of this episode that it's a joke, or at least a play on words. But no, we're not kidding. In some places, it's illegal to die. While it sounds like something from the novel Catch-22, all soldiers must be willing to die for their country, but the army forbids being killed, it's real in some places. Also known as a prohibition of death, it goes as far back as the 5th century BC, when it was forbidden to die on the Greek island of Delos. The reason? The island was sacred, and those ancient Greeks didn't want it contaminated with death. There are many reasons why it's illegal to die in some places today, and that's what we'll look into in this episode of the Infographic Show, Places on Earth Where You Aren't Allowed to Die. Biritiba Marine, Brazil. An NBC News headline in 2005 read, "Death Outlawed in Brazil Town." The town is called Biritiba Mirim, and it lies about 45 miles outside of São Paulo. What happened? Well, the mayor of the town, Roberto Pereira da Silva, was trying to get the bill passed that made it illegal to die. He knew it sounded ridiculous, but he felt he had to make a statement to the Brazilian government so some help would come to the town. You see, the cemeteries are full in the town. There's literally no room to be buried, and the city can't get planning permission to build another cemetery. The mayor also hopes it will make people take better care of themselves. The bill reads, "Take good care of your health in order not to die. Infractors will be held responsible for their acts." Celia and Falciano del Masico, Italy. Nope, you can't die in Celia, not without incurring a fine for those relatives you left behind. This tiny town only has a population of around 530 people, and it is quickly becoming depopulated. While the mayor realizes he can't fight death, he made the law so people would try to live longer. Those who don't take good care of themselves, or who take on habits that are against their health, will be punished with more taxes. He said the bill is no joke, as the town is literally running out of people. Also in Italy is the small town of Falciano del Masico near Naples. People are not allowed to die here also because there is no room for bodies. It is forbidden, with immediate effect, to all citizens resident in the municipality of Falciano del Masico and to whoever passes by its territory to cross the border of earthly life and to enter the afterlife, reads the edict. Here, people cannot even die because there is no room in the cemetery, said one old resident of the town when interviewed by Reuters in 2012. The pensioner said, "You have to die and get buried in the nearby town of Mondragone." Perhaps amusing to some, though not the old man it seems, he added, "And if you go to Mondragone, you have to pay more, because the Camorra Mafia wants money to get you a place in Mondragone." Apparently, the mayor there has been asking people to try their hardest to hold off death, at least until they can build a new cemetery. Sarparins, France. Again, we had the problem of there being no room in the cemetery. This village only has around 260 people living in it, but if residents die, there is nowhere to put them. Mayor Gerard Lalaine wrote the bill around a decade ago. It read, "All persons not having a plot in the cemetery and wishing to be buried in Sarparins are forbidden from dying in the parish. Offenders will be severely punished." Again, the town was refused permission to build another cemetery, but while the law is a political statement, it's also real. Still, it's not clear what the punishment is if you do end up dying in Sarparins. Lanjarón, Spain. Over in Spain, in the small town of Lanjarón, they have the same law for exactly the same reason. There is no space for those damn dead bodies. The good news is that because of all the press their towns are getting, governments in these countries are moving in a positive direction to make space for the dead. Still, as we research this, we cannot find any articles that tell us the problem has been solved. Itsukushima, Japan. You can always trust the Japanese to be eccentric. Unlike the laws we've so far discussed, this rule about not being able to die is closer to the ancient Greeks banning death in Delos. The Japanese believe this island is sacred as it holds the Itsukushima Shrine, so in 1878, they banned death. They also banned life in a way. Pregnant women are not allowed to give birth on the island. If they have any health issues, are not allowed to die there either. The girls must go to the mainland to have a kid, and the elderly must get off the island when their time is up. This supposedly keeps the place pure. It goes without saying that people cannot be buried on this island. Longyearbyen, Norway. Looking at photos of this place, you might want to die if you live there. Situated in the icy climes of Norway, this is one of the northernmost towns in the world that has a population of over 1,000 people. It's kind of famous for being right next to where the Svalbard Global Seed Vault is, a futuristic vault that will survive if everything else on Earth dies. Well, if a few folks survive, they know where they can get seeds. We wonder who has the keys though. With a yearly temperature of cold, cold, and cold, the reason you can't die here is because bodies cannot decompose. As one media report explains, dying has been banned on the island since 1950 when it was discovered that bodies in the local cemetery were not decomposing because of the chilly temperatures. It goes further than just having a small town full of intact buried people. Scientists found that the dead bodies still carried a deadly flu virus, which ain't good for the living. A news report explains, in a bleak prospect, those who are terminally ill are shipped off the island and flown hundreds of miles to the mainland city of Oslo, where they will spend the remainder of their days until death. You can't even have a kid there as there is no hospital. This is one grim town, seeing as for months people live without any sunlight and the place is surrounded by hungry polar bears.
John F. Kennedy remains unique among American presidents. Not only was he the youngest man ever elected president at 43 years and 163 days on the day of his election, but he was also the only American president to ever win either the Navy and Marine Corps Medal or a Purple Heart, let alone both of those distinguished awards. Yet when questioned about how he'd become a war hero, Kennedy was famously tight-lipped and simply responded, "It was involuntary. They sunk my boat." The date is August 1st, 1943, and a young 25-year-old Kennedy is a lieutenant in the U.S. Navy, in charge of a patrol torpedo boat in the Solomon Islands. The PT boats, as they were known, were widely used by American forces across both the Pacific, the Atlantic, and the Mediterranean against the Axis powers. While other navies of the world made use of small, high-speed patrol craft, it was the Americans who embraced these agile craft with a murderous gusto. Known as speed demons or as the Devil Fleet by the Japanese it terrorized, PT boats operated in groups and relied on sheer speed to overwhelm much larger and more dangerous opponents. The boats were often made of nothing but light woods, with no armor plating and little, if any, protection. The lightweight gave the boats incredible speeds, reaching as high as 46 miles per hour, and allowed small groups of them to descend on much larger and slower vessels, launch their torpedoes, and tear away before the enemy could react. Often PT boats would operate at night with the help of radar, and they would slowly cruise near enemy ships before launching into a high-speed suicidal charge and then howling away into the night. The Americans made great use of PT boats in the Pacific, where they regularly went up against much larger ships, such as destroyers, cruisers, and even battleships. Many of the first PT boat crews had either been high-speed boat racers back home or race aficionados, and their expertise was quickly put to use in developing tactics and upgrades for the PT boat fleet. As the war raged, PT boat crews got particularly creative and often made very unofficial upgrades to their boats, like bolting on additional main battle tank guns and anti-aircraft cannons. A PT boat could never have too many guns and bristled with firepower, making them a small but terrifying threat. JFK's PT boat, PT-109, was famously decked out with the stolen U.S. Army 37mm anti-tank gun, which was bolted to the bow of the boat. If it was big and it could shoot, PT boat crews would inevitably find some way to lash it onto their ships and roar off into combat with their completely unsanctioned upgrades. On the night of August 1st, 1943, JFK's PT boat was one of a 4-boat flotilla on a mission to intercept Japanese destroyers undertaking supply runs in the Solomon Islands. Intense island-island fighting had stretched out Japanese supply lines, and intercepting incoming supply drops was critical to the success of the men fighting on the beaches and jungles of the Pacific. Each destroyer that made it to its destination full of vital supplies meant that many more American lives lost, and the PT boat crews were determined to stop the vital flow of supplies no matter the cost. Yet, going up against a modern Japanese destroyer was no easy feat, especially when a single shell from its main armament would be enough to kill all on board the light and unarmored PT boats. Speed and mobility was their only protection, and the PT boat crews relied on surprise and sheer aggression to get home safely. That night, however, the situation was about as poor as could be for a flotilla of PT boats on the prowl for a victim. There was no moon out and cloud cover blotted out the stars. Visibility was limited to only a few hundred meters, and to make things worse, only one of the 4 boats had a radar unit installed. Suddenly, the boat with a radar roared off into the dark, chasing after a Japanese target. But the other 3 boats were left behind, completely blind. They silently chugged along at a low speed, because while the visibility was poor, any Japanese aircraft would be able to easily spot the wake of a PT boat due to the phosphorescent plankton that their propellers churned up. JFK was especially cautious as just days before, on his first patrol, a Japanese fighter had dropped 2 bombs near his boat and seriously injured 2 of his crew. Scanning the pitch-dark ocean, a gunner in the forward gun turret peers carefully into the dark. Alarmed at what he suddenly realizes is a Japanese ship coming straight for them, he yells out a warning, "Ship at 2 o'clock!" Scanning the ocean though, Kennedy can't see anything, until finally, at 200 yards and closing fast, he sees it, a wall of rapidly approaching water, the wake from a large Japanese ship. Kennedy attempts to move his boat into position to launch a torpedo at the oncoming ship. But while trying to avoid enemy air patrols, he had turned off one of the engines. Now he desperately tries to throttle the second engine up while the first struggles to move the boat out of the way. The Japanese, however, are equipped with radar and don't need to see their target. They've realized the small PT boat isn't running with both engines, and they accelerate and put themselves on a direct collision course. With a roaring of seawater and splintering wood, the huge Japanese destroyer strikes the PT boat directly in the middle. The steel bow of the Japanese ship shatters the much smaller boat and splits it in 2 across the midsection. 2 of the 13-man crew are instantly killed, and a third is thrown overboard and sucked into the destroyer's wake, where the force of the water displaced by the mighty propeller beats him mercilessly. JFK himself is hurtled against his boat's deck and severely injures his back, while an engineer below decks has his face and arms badly burned by the igniting gasoline before the ocean sucks him down into the depths and then spits him back up. The Japanese ship doesn't even bother to stop to pick up survivors and take them prisoner, and instead simply continues on into the inky darkness. The PT boat's light wooden hulls prove to be a lifesaver here, as incredibly both halves of the boat remain afloat. Kennedy, who had been a member of the Harvard swim team, then leaps into the water and spends the next half hour rescuing the 11 survivors and dragging them back to the remains of the boat. At dawn, though, there was no sign of rescue, and Kennedy knew that they couldn't remain on their stricken vessel as it would eventually sink. An experienced sailor and navigator, Kennedy had familiarized himself with the Solomon Islands and their currents, and spotting a small smudge in the distance he knew to be a small island called Plum Island, he told his men to prepare for a very long swim. The engineer, who had been below decks, however, still had fresh and agonizing burns across his body and was in no shape to make the 3-mile swim on his own. Despite his injured back, Kennedy incredibly leapt into the water and cut a strap loose from the engineer's life vest, gripping it in his teeth. For 5 hours, Kennedy slowly swam, pulling along the injured engineer, refusing to let the man drown. When he finally made it to shore, he had swallowed so much seawater that he had become violently ill and immediately vomited. Back at base, the crew of the PT-109 had already been given up for dead, leaving Kennedy and his men on a tiny island behind enemy lines and armed with only 2 pistols, no food, and no fresh water. Determined to get his men safely back home, Kennedy ignored the threat of prowling sharks and incredibly swam back out into the ocean that night, carrying a lantern and a pistol, which he hoped he could use to signal any passing PT boat. Unfortunately, none would materialize, and to make matters worse, as he tried to swim back, a rogue current dragged Kennedy far from the island. The president-to-be would spend the entire night treading water, convinced he'd never see his men again and that he'd eventually drown. Yet, as the morning sun climbed into the sky, Kennedy was amazed to find that another current had actually carried him back to the island. Having ditched his heavy boots so he could more easily swim, Kennedy then made his way across a razor-sharp reef, badly cutting his feet. With no food, the crew was now starving, and the next day Kennedy rallied them once more and convinced them to swim to another nearby island where there might be coconuts to eat. Once more, he towed the injured engineer for another incredible 3-hour swim, this time with badly lacerated feet, and once more risking the threat of shark attack. At the island, the men found edible coconuts and fresh water in the leaves of the island's bushes and trees, which the men greedily drank up. Unfortunately, they wouldn't notice until dawn that the leaves had all been covered in bird poop the entire time. For the next few days, Kennedy and another of his crew would swim from island to island, constantly looking for food to bring back to the crew. On August 5th, 4 days after the collision, Kennedy and his crewmen were spotted by what he feared were Japanese soldiers, but turned out to be friendly natives. Kennedy inscribed a simple message into a coconut shell with a knife, so that the natives could relay it to the U.S. Navy personnel as they spoke no English. The message read, "Naro ISL Commander, native knows Posit. He can pilot, 11 alive, need small boat, Kennedy." Incredibly, the shell made its way to a New Zealand infantry patrol who then put JFK in radio contact with his PT base. Kennedy would go on to use that shell as a paperweight in the Oval Office when he won the presidency. Despite a serious injury, Kennedy did as he had promised and brought his men home, and the incredible fortitude and courage he showed serves as an example to this day. Think you have what it takes to survive what Kennedy went through? Let us know in the comments, and as always, if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more great content.